The day begins, though you might not notice it at first. A pale light, like thin rice paper held up to the sun, seeps in through the wooden slats of the shutters. Outside, there's the faint shuffle of straw sandals over gravel, and somewhere far off, the hollow call of a temple bell. You're in the city of Heiankyo, modern Kyoto, though no one here would call it that, and the year is sometime in the mid-9th century. You probably won't make it through this day, but that's all right. Most people don't. Before we wander any further, I'll gently remind you that if this quiet walk through an emperor's peculiar life suits your evening, you can like and subscribe for more long, slow histories. It's free, and it lets me keep doing this without being forced to collect rocks of my own. And if your eyelids aren't too heavy already, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I promise to imagine it and nod politely. Now, let's ease into tonight's journey. You begin by following a narrow path lined with plum trees, their blossoms fluttering like paper confetti, though no one here is celebrating anything in particular. You're making your way toward the imperial palace, where the Emperor Ninmyu, the 64th ruler of Japan, spends his mornings not, as you might expect, in matters of state or diplomacy, but in the careful inspection of his rock garden. Rocks, after all, are serious business here. In this era, collecting rare stones is not just a hobby, but an imperial pastime. While other rulers in distant lands might demand gold or wheat as tribute, Ninmyu prefers a good boulder with an interesting grain pattern. You wonder how a tax inspector feels about hauling a 300-pound lump of volcanic basalt down from the mountains instead of carrying coins. Historians still debate whether Ninmyu's passion for rocks was symbolic, a way of showing connection to the land, or simply a distraction from the more tedious aspects of governing. Either way, the result is the same. The palace gardens are full of stones, some smooth and round like river-polished eggs, others jagged and pitted like frozen waves. You walk past a courtier who is clearly trying to look important, but is currently engaged in the delicate task of brushing dust off a particularly shiny specimen. He's wearing layered silk robes in shades of faded blue, a color chosen perhaps to match the stone he's tending. He can't tell if the emperor instructed this, or if it's just coincidence, but either way, it feels like too much coordination for this early in the day. Somewhere nearby, someone's reading poetry aloud, something about the steadfastness of the mountains, the passage of clouds, and the inevitable slipping of your sandals into the ornamental pond if you're not paying attention. The air smells faintly of cedar, and the sweet, slightly fermented aroma of rice wine warming in the kitchen. The emperor himself appears in the distance, moving slowly, hands clasped behind his back. His expression is serene, the kind of serenity you suspect only comes from knowing. You're not expected to open a ledger or answer questions about military spending. He stops to admire a granite boulder, nods approvingly, then gestures for two attendants to rotate it a few degrees. You've just watched an imperial decree in action, and so the morning drifts on, unhurried, the way mornings should be when your main source of national revenue is measured in pounds of igneous rock. The palace kitchens are beginning to stir now, though not with the frenzy you'd find in some medieval courts. Here, cooking is an exercise in patience, much like rock collecting. You pass through a covered walkway where the scent of steaming millet and miso soup drifts in. Someone is slicing pickled radishes with the precision of a calligrapher making his first stroke of the day. You pause near the garden's edge where a servant is polishing a black stone so smooth it reflects the sky. He tells you in a low voice that this one came from the Izu Peninsula, carried overland for weeks, wrapped in straw and cloth to keep it from chipping. He says it's said to resemble the shape of a sleeping crane, though you tilt your head and mostly see rock. You nod politely anyway. The emperor's interest in these stones has had curious effects on the city's economy. Instead of merchants boasting of their silks or spices, some now display small, oddly shaped pebbles in their stalls, hoping to catch the attention of a passing court official. It's a kind of geological fashion trend, though you can't help but imagine the confusion of a foreign trader arriving in Heiankyo, expecting to barter gold, and finding instead that the hot commodity is a rock that looks like a turnip. You wander past a side courtyard where a few younger courtiers are clearly less enchanted by the emperor's passion. They are sitting cross-legged, debating the merits of various stones in tones that suggest they might be poking fun. One holds up a small lump and declares, "This one perfectly symbolizes my will to get out of bed this morning." The others nod gravely, as though this is both true and deeply profound. Still, the rock collecting has a practical side. Large flat stones are used to create shaded seating areas in the gardens, while smaller ones are arranged into careful compositions that mirror the distant mountains. It is a way, the court poet once claimed, of bringing the far into the near, though he may also have just been trying to justify why they spent 3 days moving a rock 2 feet to the left. Historians still debate whether the emperor's collection ever served as a kind of map, each stone placed to represent a province, an unspoken symbol of imperial unity. If that was the intention, it's now entirely lost, since several courtiers have moved pieces around over the years to improve the view. As you leave the courtyard, you notice a familiar plum tree from earlier, its petals still drifting down like pale snow. The same path leads back toward the main audience hall, though the palace guards are in no hurry to move you along. Life here runs at the pace of a stone's slow weathering. In the audience chamber, a meeting is about to begin. You half expect discussions of border disputes or trade agreements, but instead, the first item on the agenda is whether a certain boulder would look better in the southern garden. You realize you've entered a world where politics and landscaping are sometimes indistinguishable, and so the day stretches onward, as soft and deliberate as the sound of the wind over gravel, carrying with it the faint promise that the most important decision you'll witness is which way to turn a rock. By mid-morning, the palace has reached what could generously be described as peak activity, though compared to most imperial courts, it still feels like a lazy Sunday that never quite wakes up. You follow the emperor's retinue toward a shaded veranda where a selection of his prized stones has been arranged for private viewing. The attendants refer to this as the gallery, though it's really just a series of low wooden tables, each topped with a rock and a small handwritten poem. One stone is streaked with white lines that resemble a mountain range under snow. The poem reads, "A mountain waits patient through the ages. The tea grows cold." You appreciate the sentiment, though you also note that someone has spilled actual tea on the paper, adding an unplanned brown blot to the composition. The emperor leans in close to another specimen, an oddly lopsided hunk of riverstone. He hums approvingly. A courtier quickly scribbles down the moment, perhaps for future reference in the imperial chronicles. You imagine those chronicles filled with entries like, "Today, His Majesty favored the eastern granite." The mood was serene. As you watch, a delegation arrives from a distant province, their offerings carried on lacquered trays. You expect silk, perhaps rice, but once again, the gifts are rock-polished, speckled, carved into shapes both abstract and strangely literal. One tray holds a stone carved into the form of a turtle, its shell meticulously detailed. The delegation leader bows and explains that it represents longevity. The emperor nods, though you suspect he also just likes turtles. This kind of tribute system has led to some odd competition among provinces. Some officials spend months scouring riverbeds or cliffsides for the perfect specimen, while others have been known to encourage a stone's natural beauty with a chisel. Historians still debate whether these modified stones were considered deceitful or simply artistic. A scribe sits nearby, recording the day's acquisitions. You peek over his shoulder to see neat brushstrokes listing each stone's origin, weight, and emotional resonance. That last category seems subjective, but the scribe assures you it is the most important metric of all. The veranda is warm now, the light filtering through bamboo blinds. A faint breeze carries the smell of sandalwood from a nearby incense burner. Someone has begun strumming a koto, the notes slow and deliberate, as though in sympathy with the pace of imperial decision-making. After a while, the emperor thanks the delegation and dismisses them with small gifts in return: folded cloth, dried persimmons, and, in one case, what looks suspiciously like a less impressive rock from his own collection. Recycling, it seems, is not a modern invention. As you follow the group back inside, you notice the floorboards creak gently underfoot, their polished surfaces worn smooth by centuries of similar processions. Somewhere outside, a cuckoo calls, its voice echoing in the still air. Time here feels slow and cyclical, each day folding neatly into the next, like the layers of a silk robe. Late morning is tea time in the palace, though this is less about caffeine and more about ceremony. You find yourself seated on a woven mat in a side pavilion, a low table before you. The tea is green, frothy, and slightly bitter, served in ceramic cups that feel warm and solid in your hands. The emperor joins, taking his place at the head of the table. His robes today are patterned with stylized waves appropriate, given the conversation soon turns to a newly arrived stone from the coast of San Riku. It's a dark, glossy piece, said to resemble a breaking wave. Courtiers murmur their approval, though you notice one elderly minister squinting at it as if trying to see the resemblance and failing. The tea is accompanied by small sweets, pressed rice cakes, shaped like plum blossoms, dusted with fine sugar. They dissolve on your tongue in a way that makes you wonder if they are designed to be forgotten as soon as they are eaten. During the conversation, one courtier recounts a peculiar custom from a far-off island in the Ryukyu chain, where villagers stack flat stones at the edges of their fields to bring good harvests. The emperor listens, intrigued, and makes a note to acquire one authentic fieldstone for the palace. Historians still debate whether he ever got it, or if the request was quietly ignored by local officials. You glance around the room and see that even the tea utensils have been chosen with care. Bamboo whisks, carved so finely they look almost too delicate to use. Teapots with subtle imperfections that make them all the more valuable. The same principle, it seems, applies to rocks. Perfection is dull. Asymmetry is art. The koto music drifts in again from the veranda, joined now by the faint sound of someone sweeping gravel in the garden. The rhythmic scrape of the broom is oddly hypnotic. You find yourself wondering if the emperor ever does this himself, just to see how it feels. The tea session ends without ceremony. People simply rise, bow slightly, and wander back to their various duties, which in this palace often means contemplating stones in different parts of the garden. You follow the emperor toward a shaded grove, where the sunlight filters through the leaves, breaking into shifting patterns on the moss below. And there, almost hidden, is a boulder so large it seems impossible it was ever moved here by human hands. The emperor stops, gazes at it for a long moment, and says quietly, "This one stays exactly where it is." It's the most decisive thing you've heard him say all day. The afternoon begins with the sound of distant drums, not war drums, but the slow, steady beat that marks the start of a poetry gathering. You follow the rhythm through a corridor lined with painted screens, landscapes in inkwash, cranes lifting into mist, and one slightly awkward depiction of a rock that suggests the artist may have been better at trees. In the main hall, the emperor is already seated on a raised platform, a scroll in hand. Around him, courtiers sit in neat rows, each clutching their own compositions. The theme for today's gathering, you soon learn, is stones and seasons. This is less limiting than it sounds apparently. Season can mean anything from the literal weather to the season of one's heart, which, if you're not careful, can drift into dangerously sentimental territory. A young courtier reads first, his poem about a smooth river pebble carried downstream in spring. His voice is soft, almost a whisper, and you wonder if this is to be poetic, or if he's just worried about being overheard by the emperor's poetry critic, who is known for sighing audibly when displeased. The emperor follows with his own verse, which is brief and, you suspect, intentionally vague. Stone waits in the rain, knowing the sun will return, but not when. The room nods in appreciation, though you detect a few puzzled looks from the younger poets. One of the more unusual readings comes from an older minister, who recalls a stone he saw as a child that looked like a sleeping ox. He claims it was so beloved in his village that no one dared move it for decades. Historians still debate whether such stones were genuine community treasures or simply too heavy for anyone to bother relocating. The gathering is punctuated by the quiet shuffle of servants refilling cups with warm rice wine. The scent is faintly sweet, mixing with the earthy temps of tatami mats. You notice the way the emperor's gaze lingers on certain stones depicted in the painted scrolls hung along the wall, as though mentally cataloguing them for a future expedition. After the final poem is read a humorous piece comparing a stubborn stone to a stubborn spouse. The emperor rises, offering a few words of praise. Then, with the ease of someone entirely in control of the schedule, he announces that the rest of the afternoon will be spent visiting the southern gardens. You leave the hall in a quiet procession, the air outside warmer now, the sunlight stretched into long beams that catch in the dust. Somewhere behind you, a servant rolls up the painted screens, tucking away the images of mountains, cranes, and rocks until the next gathering. The southern gardens are larger, more open, and if you believe the palace rumor mill home to the emperor's favorite stone of all. You walk along a gravel path edged with moss-covered lanterns, each one leaning slightly, as though bowing to the visitors. The air is heavy with the scent of blooming wisteria, their violet clusters swaying lazily in the breeze. It's here that the emperor seems most at ease. He pauses often, leaning down to brush a hand over the surface of a stone, or adjust the placement of a smaller rock in a border arrangement. The courtiers follow at a respectful distance, though you suspect some of them are mostly here to enjoy the fresh air. At the center of the garden is the famed moon mirror stone, a large, flat slab that holds a shallow pool of water. On clear nights, it reflects the moon perfectly, a natural mirror framed in granite. Today, the pool reflects only drifting clouds and the occasional wisp of a passing dragonfly. A courtier explains that this stone was carried here from a river nearly 50 miles away, an undertaking that took an entire season and an unknown number of sore backs. Historians still debate whether the effort was worth it, though the court poet insists it was the only stone that could hold the moon without breaking it. Nearby, a gardener is raking the gravel into concentric circles around a group of smaller stones. You watch as the patterns slowly emerge, each curve precise and deliberate. There's a quiet satisfaction in the rhythm of it, like watching waves form without wind. The emperor lingers here, his hands clasped behind his back, head tilted just slightly, an expression you've come to recognize as approval. Not all of the southern garden's stones are grand. In one shaded corner, tucked among ferns, is a stone no bigger than a melon, its surface mottled with pale green lichen. This, you're told, was a gift from a monk who claimed it was the most peaceful stone he had ever met. You resist the urge to ask what constitutes a restless stone. The visit ends at a pavilion overlooking the garden's edge, where the palace grounds fade into a line of dark pines. The emperor sits for a while, sipping tea and watching the shadows lengthen. No one speaks. The breeze carries the faint sound of a bamboo waterspout filling, tipping, and emptying over and over, as though marking time in a way that has nothing to do with hours. It occurs to you that in this court, a day's success is measured not in decrees or battles won, but in the quiet certainty that every stone is exactly where it ought to be. By late afternoon, the sun has settled into a mellow gold, casting the palace corridors in long, drowsy shadows. You follow the emperor indoors again, this time into what the attendants call the Hall of Small Treasures. It's not the grand reception hall, nor the tea pavilion. This is a more private space, reserved for objects too delicate, too eccentric, or too oddly shaped to withstand the weather outside. The air here is cooler, faintly scented with camphor wood from the storage chests. Low shelves line the walls, each holding a single stone displayed on a cushion of deep indigo silk. Some are smooth enough to resemble polished metal. Others are pitted and gnarled, like miniature landscapes in themselves. You find one that looks almost exactly like the back of a curled sleeping cat. The placard beneath it simply reads, "Gift from Ichigo Province, Winter, 847. The emperor moves through the room with an unhurried rhythm, pausing at certain stones as if reacquainting himself with old friends. You notice how he sometimes tilts his head, not to examine the stone, but to catch the way light touches its surface. It's not unlike the way some people admire paintings, except here, the artist is time itself. One courtier whispers to another about a particularly strange item, a pale stone streaked with what looks like writing. The emperor claims it's natural veining, but the story persists that a monk once saw a poem in it. Historians still debate whether the monk actually read anything or simply wanted to impress his dinner companions. There's a soft hum of voices, but no one speaks loudly. You can hear the faint rustle of silk sleeves as people bow slightly before certain stones, as though acknowledging their seniority in the collection. This is less a gallery and more a temple of geological reverence. In one corner, a young attendant is polishing a stone no bigger than a plum, rubbing it gently with a cloth until its surface gleams. He tells you it's volcanic glass from the island of Cedo, brought by fishermen who insisted it had the power to cool tempers. You can't help but think this would be a useful diplomatic tool, though perhaps in this court, simply handing someone a nice rock works just as well. The emperor stops before a jade-colored boulder with a faint crack running through it. He touches the crack with the tip of one finger, then turns to leave, saying nothing. The moment lingers in the air like the aftertaste of strong tea, brief, but quietly significant. As you step back into the corridor, the evening light is softer still, brushing the paper screens in a pale glow. Somewhere far off, a nightingale calls, its notes slipping gently into the warm, still air. Dinner in the palace is not a hurried affair. By the time you reach the main dining hall, the tatami mats have been freshly swept, and low lacquered tables set out in neat rows. The arrangement is deliberate. No one sits too close to the emperor, but no one is too far away, either a geometry of politeness. The menu tonight is as calm and understated as everything else in this court. Grilled river fish with a sprinkling of salt, bowls of steamed rice, pickled mountain vegetables, and a light soup made from miso and tofu. Each dish is presented with the kind of precision that makes you wonder if the cooks measure the angle of the radish slices. The emperor eats slowly, occasionally glancing toward the decorative alcove at the end of the room. There, on a simple wooden stand, sits a stone with a faint shimmer, as if it's been lightly dusted with frost. It's a new arrival, gifted by a provincial governor just last month. One courtier quietly explains that it's quartz, said to hold the coolness of winter even in summer. You resist the urge to touch it, though you suspect the emperor would understand if you did. Midway through the meal, conversation turns to an upcoming festival in the city. A merchant has proposed setting up a public display of unusual stones, hoping to draw both commoners and visiting dignitaries. The emperor seems mildly amused by the idea, but says nothing definitive. Historians still debate whether this was royal indifference or strategic non-commitment. The meal ends with a dessert of sweet bean paste wrapped in thin layers of rice flour. They're soft, almost cloud-like, dissolving the moment they touch your tongue. Outside, a faint breeze rattles the bamboo wind chimes, their irregular tones mingling with the last chatter of sparrows settling for the night. As the courtiers begin to rise, the emperor remains seated, his gaze fixed on the quartz stone in the alcove. You wonder if he's imagining the winter snow reflected in its facets, or perhaps just thinking about how to rearrange the northern garden tomorrow. Either way, the moment stretches, unbroken, until the servants begin clearing the tables. And then, with the same unhurried grace that has marked the entire day, the emperor stands, ready to step into the quiet of the evening. Night falls gently over the palace, as though the sky itself has decided not to make a fuss about it. The air is cooler now, carrying the scent of pine resin and damp earth. Paper lanterns are being lit one by one along the covered walkways. Their glow a soft amber that makes the wooden beams look almost alive. You followed the emperor toward the eastern gardens, a place reserved for evening strolls. Here, the stones are smaller, arranged in patterns meant to be appreciated under moonlight. Some are pale enough to catch the glow of the lanterns, while others seem to disappear into the shadows entirely. The effect is like walking through a quiet, unmarked constellation. One courtier points out a stone said to resemble a sleeping fox. You squint, tilt your head, and maybe, just maybe, you see it. The emperor nods in agreement, though you suspect he's being generous. Historians still debate whether these resemblances were ever real, or if they were simply invented to make court life more interesting. The sound of a bamboo waterspout tipping and refilling repeats in the background, its rhythm as steady as breathing. Somewhere nearby, a cricket starts its nightly song, joined soon after by another, until the air feels gently quilted with sound. The emperor pauses beside a low bench, carved from a single block of stone, and sits. No one speaks. In the stillness, you notice the faint shimmer of dew beginning to form on the rocks, turning them into small mirrors that catch whatever light happens to find them. You imagine the emperor appreciates this uninvited embellishment, nature's way of polishing the collection without being asked. Eventually, the group begins to move again, looping back toward the main hall. As you pass under the last arch of lanterns, you feel the way the night seems to close in behind you, leaving the garden to its crickets, its stones, and the slow drift of moonlight across the gravel. The palace at night is not silent, it's simply a different kind of awake. You hear the faint knock of wooden clappers from the night watch, marking the passing hours. A distant rustle from the kitchens suggests that someone is preparing the midnight rice porridge, a comfort for the sleepless. Inside, the emperor retreats to a smaller chamber for what might generously be called administrative duties. This is where petitions from the provinces are read aloud, though tonight's stack is notably thin. The first is a request for additional funds to repair a collapsed bridge. The second is an offer to send a rare stone from a riverbed said to be haunted by a benevolent spirit. The emperor listens politely to both, then makes a note only beside the stone. One attendant, perhaps emboldened by the quiet, dares to ask why His Majesty prefers stones over more practical tribute. The emperor's answer is simple. Rice feeds the body for a day. A stone lasts for generations. You can't help but think it's also easier to store. As the evening wears on, the room grows warmer from the small brazier in the corner. The faint crackle of the charcoal blends with the rustling of paper as the petitions are set aside. A scribe records the emperor's comments, his brush gliding in deliberate strokes. You wonder if future historians will puzzle over entries like, approved, placement of new boulder near plum tree. Before the night ends, a musician enters with a shamisen, playing a slow, lilting tune. The sound fills the chamber like water in a shallow bowl, soft, contained, but complete. The emperor closes his eyes, listening, one hand resting on the low table beside him. When the final notes fade, there's no applause, no dismissal, just a shared understanding that the day has folded in on itself. Outside, the night air is still and cool, and somewhere in the gardens, the dew has finished its quiet work on the stones. The hours before dawn belong to the palace's quieter residents. You wake, or perhaps you never fully slept too. The muffled shuffle of slippered feet in the corridor. Lantern light glows faintly through the paper screens, carried by a servant making early rounds. The air is cooler, the kind that makes you instinctively draw your robe closer. The emperor is already awake, seated in a small study overlooking the inner courtyard. Here, there are no attendants except for a single scribe and the inevitable presence of a stone, this one a flat, oval shape with a polished surface that reflects the dim light like a shallow pond. The emperor stares at it for a moment, then at the first hints of grey sky beyond the roofline, as if comparing the two. On the desk beside him lies a set of small wooden boxes. Inside each are stones so tiny they could fit in your palm, river-worn pebbles from distant provinces, each labeled in neat calligraphy. The emperor picks one up, turns it over in his fingers, and sets it back in place. It's not unlike watching someone choose a teacup from a collection intensely personal, with no wrong answer. The scribe begins to read notes from the previous day, updates on provincial harvests, a request to send an imperial envoy to bless a new shrine, and an inventory list of the rock garden. This last item is read with the same seriousness as the others, though you can hear the faintest hitch in the scribe's voice when he says, "The moon mirror stone remains unchanged." Historians still debate whether this early morning ritual was a form of meditation, or just the emperor's way of avoiding busier court hours. Either way, it gives the impression of a ruler deeply attentive to the small, unhurried things in life. The first bird calls begin outside clear, high notes that feel almost too sharp for this drowsy hour. The emperor rises, sliding the paper door open to step into the courtyard. The stones there are wet with dew, shining faintly in the half-light. He walks slowly along the path, hands clasped behind his back, the gravel crunching softly underfoot. You trail after him, noticing how the damp air makes every scent sharper. Cedar, moss, and the faint metallic temps of the stones themselves. The day hasn't begun yet, but already it feels full. By sunrise, the palace is awake again, though never in a hurry. Servants carry trays of breakfast, steamed rice, grilled fish, miso soup, while the courtiers drift toward their morning posts. You find yourself once again in the main garden, where the emperor has arranged a small assembly of attendants and gardeners. Today's task is nothing less than the repositioning of a particular boulder. It's not especially large, but it sits in a place where the emperor feels it faces the wrong direction. You're not sure how one determines the emotional orientation of a rock, but no one questions it. The gardeners work slowly, using wooden levers and ropes to ease the stone into its new position. The emperor watches intently, offering the occasional nod or small adjustment to their trajectory. At one point, a courtier suggests shifting it another inch, but the emperor shakes his head apparently. Perfection has been achieved. Historians still debate whether these adjustments were aesthetic impulses, or if they held deeper symbolic meaning. Some argue that moving a stone in the garden was akin to moving a star in the imperial cosmology, a deliberate reshaping of the world's balance. Others think he just liked things to line up nicely. Once the work is done, the emperor invites everyone to sit for tea on a nearby veranda. The early light filters through the garden trees, dappling the polished wood floor. Steam curls from the teacups, carrying the grassy scent of fresh matcha. Someone remarks that the stone now seems more harmonious, and everyone agrees, even those who likely can't see the difference. As the tea is poured, a gardener tells a story about a stone in his home village that sings when struck lightly with bamboo. The emperor's eyes brighten at this, and he makes a note to investigate. You have the distinct feeling that, by next season, that stone will be in this garden too. The morning passes in this way: small tasks, small stories, and the quiet sense that nothing truly urgent will intrude. The sun climbs higher, and the stones cast shorter shadows, as if they too are settling in for the day. The warmth of midday settles over the palace like a thick quilt. Even the courtiers seem slower now, their layered robes trapping the heat in ways that suggest neither comfort nor practicality. You drift toward the western garden, a less formal space where the stones are arranged with a touch more whimsy. Here, one boulder is placed at the center of a shallow pond, reachable only by stepping across a path of flat stones. A young attendant explains, in all seriousness, that this boulder represents patience, because you have to wait for the koi to move before you can admire its full shape. You suspect the koi have no such philosophical intentions. The emperor arrives, moving with the same deliberate pace as always. He stops by a cluster of smaller stones, each shaped vaguely like animals: a rabbit, a crane, perhaps a reclining deer. The court poet insists these shapes are purely natural, though the amused glance between two gardeners nearby suggests that human hands may have helped nature along. Historians still debate how often imperial stones were improved in this manner, though the official records, predictably, say never. A light breeze stirs the surface of the pond, blurring the boulder's reflection. The emperor watches it for a long moment, then remarks that the water's movement reminds the stone that the world changes, even if it doesn't. The courtiers nod, as though this is deeply profound, though one seems to be suppressing a yawn. Nearby, a servant sets out trays of chilled barley tea and small plates of sliced melon. The sweetness of the fruit is a small, welcome shock after the earthy taste of matcha. You take your time, letting the juice cool your mouth, while the breeze carries the scent of wisteria from somewhere further down the path. The emperor eventually turns away from the pond and begins walking toward a small hill at the garden's edge. From the top, you can see much of the city-tiled roofs, narrow streets, and far in the distance, the shimmer of the river. He doesn't speak, but you can almost imagine what he's thinking, that somewhere out there, perhaps even now, someone is finding a stone they'll one day bring to him. Later in the afternoon, the palace holds what could loosely be described as a scholarly exchange. This takes place in a shaded hall lined with shelves of scrolls, many of them maps, others records of poetry contests, and a surprising number simply cataloguing rocks. The emperor sits at the head of the room while a visiting monk presents a lecture on the symbolic properties of different minerals. He speaks in a slow, steady tone that matches the room's drowsy air. Quartz for clarity of thought, jade for moral virtue, basalt for resilience. At one point, he mentions a stone found in a remote valley that is said to glow faintly at night. Though he admits that no one has confirmed this in centuries, historians still debate whether such claims were believed or merely enjoyed as pleasant stories. Either way, the emperor listens without interrupting, his hands resting lightly on the low table before him. Between lectures, attendants bring trays of sesame crackers and pickled plums. The combination is unexpectedly sharp and tangy, enough to keep even the sleepiest listener from nodding off completely. You catch a courtier quietly pocketing an extra cracker, which feels both scandalous and entirely understandable. When the monk finishes, the emperor thanks him and offers a small gift, a pebble from the moon mirror stone, polished smooth and wrapped in silk. The monk bows deeply, as though receiving a treasure beyond measure. You wonder if he'll keep it as a sacred relic, or simply place it on a shelf where it will gather dust beside other royal mementos. As the gathering disperses, the late light spills into the hall, catching on the lacquered scroll cases and making the dust motes look briefly like drifting gold. Outside, the cicadas have begun their evening chorus, filling the air with a slow, undulating hum. The emperor lingers at the doorway, gazing toward the garden. You follow his line of sight and see nothing unusual, just the familiar arrangement of stones, exactly as they were this morning. But in this court, even the unchanged seems worth looking at twice. Evening deepens over the palace with a kind of gradual certainty that never startles. The lanterns are lit again, casting their soft amber pools along the covered walkways, somewhere beyond the garden walls. The city hums faintly, a reminder that life outside the palace moves at an entirely different pace. The emperor has chosen to spend the last light of the day in the northern garden. This is the quietest of them all, a place where the stones are set among low pines and moss-covered ground. The air here feels cooler, touched with the scent of damp earth and cedar. You walk behind him, listening to the slow crunch of gravel underfoot. He stops at a familiar boulder, one you've seen before, wide, weathered shape, that seems to sink into the moss, as if it's been there for centuries. The Emperor places a hand on it, as though greeting an old friend. No words are spoken. None seem necessary. The garden's stillness is punctuated only by the faint sound of water trickling from a bamboo spout into a stone basin. You notice the way the light fades unevenly here, leaving some stones in shadow, while others still catch the last pale gold of the setting sun. It's the kind of scene you could stare at for hours without tiring of it, though in truth, you feel the day's weight pressing softly against your eyes. A servant appears with a tray steaming cups of roasted barley tea and small dishes of candied chestnuts. The tea is warm, toasty, and grounding. The chestnuts dissolve into a gentle sweetness that lingers without demanding attention. The Emperor takes his time with both, sipping and chewing slowly, as though stretching the moments until night fully claims the garden. When at last the final light slips away, he rises and turns toward the palace. You follow him back through the corridors, past rooms now hushed and dim, past the moon mirror stone lying quiet under the stars. The air is cool enough now to raise a small shiver, but it's not unpleasant. Somewhere nearby, a nightingale calls, then falls silent. And so the day ends not with fanfare or decree, but with the soft certainty of stones, each one exactly where it belongs. The day begins in a kitchen that smells faintly of wood smoke, coffee, and a whiff of something sugary that's been overcooked possibly on purpose. You are in Paris, sometime around the year 1760, though if you glance out the window, the narrow, damp street outside would look much the same in 1660 or even 1560. The cobblestones are slick with last night's rain, and a boy with a basket of bread is already doing his rounds. He whistles badly, but with enthusiasm. You probably won't make it through this day, but that's all right. Most people here are just trying to make it to the next one, preferably with both shoes still intact. Before we go further, if you enjoy this kind of slow, meandering journey through the dustier corners of history, you can like and subscribe. It's free, and it helps me keep telling stories without having to take up pineapple rental as a side hustle. And if your eyes are still open, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and the local time. I promise to picture it, nod gravely, and imagine delivering this entire story directly to your living room or, possibly your pillow. Now let's ease into tonight's journey. You step out onto the Rue Saint-Honore, the air carrying a medley of scents, roasting chestnuts from a street vendor, horse dung from the passing carriage, and somewhere underneath it all, the sharp tang of the Seine. The city is already awake, though awake here often just means arguing before breakfast. A cart rumbles past, its driver shouting at a group of boys darting between the wheels. Your destination is not a market, not a salon, not even a palace, but a merchant's home where, rumor has it, a certain exotic fruit will be unveiled to select guests later today. Pineapples, in mid-18th century Paris, are the height of social currency. Not because anyone eats them, heavens, no, but because they are rare enough to be worth displaying like an emerald. Here's the historical fact. In France during this time, pineapples were so rare that some were grown only in the hothouses of the wealthy, while others were imported at great cost from Caribbean colonies. A single fruit could fetch the equivalent of hundreds of modern dollars. People didn't buy them to eat, they bought them to be seen owning them. As you pass a perfumer's shop, the scent of violets and musk drifts out, briefly masking the less glamorous smells of the street. You can almost hear the hum of conversation in drawing rooms, where invitations are being whispered, guests carefully chosen for their ability to gasp appreciatively in front of a fruit. A woman sweeps her doorway in a long, deliberate motion, her pale cap tied neatly beneath her chin. She glances at you in the way Parisians always seem to, curious, but pretending not to be. Somewhere behind her, you catch the flicker of yellow through a window, not the fruit itself, but perhaps a painting of one. Yes, even paintings of pineapples were in fashion. The city moves around Uslo, churning, full of secret sand. The thought of this evening's gathering tugs at you, like a loose thread on a well-worn coat. The merchant's house is tucked behind a courtyard, shielded from the street by a tall gate with Rortian curls. You slip inside and find the place buzzing quietly with preparation. Servants move like clockwork figures, polishing silver, arranging chairs, and most importantly positioning a long table draped in white linen at just the right angle to catch the afternoon light. On that table, resting on a shallow porcelain dish painted with delicate blue flowers, sits the star of the evening, a pineapple. Its crown is perfectly upright, its skin a precise mosaic of green-gold hexagons. It looks less like food and more like a royal relic. The merchant, a round man with an equally round wig, circles it with his hands clasped behind his back. He is smiling, but in a way that says he is also mentally calculating who in the room will later owe him a favor for having seen it. You recall a cultural tidbit. It was not unusual for hosts in this period to rent pineapples for a single event. The fruit might travel from salon to salon, growing progressively softer, but never sliced. It was a kind of celebrity guest scene, admired, but rarely touched. Historians still debate whether the eventual eating of such a pineapple was a grand finale, or simply an act of mercy. The air inside smells faintly of beeswax and freshly ironed linen. A harpsichord stands in the corner, its lid painted with tiny scenes of shepherds doing improbably clean outdoor work. A young maid pauses in her polishing to glance at the pineapple. Her expression suggests she is not convinced it's worth all the fuss. Through an open door, you glimpse the kitchen where a cook is preparing the real food for tonight: pies, glazed poultry, sugared almonds, none of which will get half the attention of the fruit sitting in the parlor. One scullery boy whispers to another that the merchant actually bought 2 pineapples, but one is hidden in the pantry in case the first one faints from overadmiration. Outside, the afternoon light filters into the courtyard, catching in the curls of the wrought iron and in the sheen of the pineapple's crown. You can almost hear the sound of carriages in the street beyond, bringing the first guests, who will pretend they came for conversation, but who really came to see the sharp, golden geometry of a fruit that most of them will never taste. By late afternoon, the city's mood changes. The pale sunlight softens into the kind of gold that flatters even the damp stone walls of Paris. You make your way back through the streets toward the merchant's house, passing where men in tricorn hats lean over tiny porcelain cups, their conversation thick with gossip. The smell of roasting coffee beans drifts into the air, mingling with the sharper scent of coal smoke. When you arrive, the courtyard gate is open. Inside, the space is transformed. Lanterns strung overhead, chairs arranged in small conversational clusters, and the pineapple now raised on a pedestal draped in white damask. Its placement is strategic, directly beneath a window where the fading sunlight turns its skin to molten gold. The first guests are already here. Ladies in wide pannier skirts glide across the flagstones like galleons on a calm sea, their fans snapping open and shut in rhythms that are less about cooling themselves and more about signaling subtle messages. Gentlemen bow low, their silk waistcoats gleaming, their wigs perfectly powdered. You overhear one man, clearly eager to display his education, remark that pineapples were first brought to Europe by Christopher Columbus. This is correct, though he says it with the air of someone who has just personally discovered the New World. A footman offers you a glass of orgeat, sweet and almondy, the kind of drink that coats the tongue. You sip it while the merchant welcomes a pair of minor nobility, each of whom manages to gasp with precisely the right amount of reverence at the sight of the fruit. It's a performance, and they know it. Here's your historical fact. By the mid-18th century, owning or even displaying a pineapple had become so closely tied to wealth and status that they appeared carved into the facades of buildings, painted into portraits, and embroidered on waistcoats. The fruit's image meant refinement, travel, and enough money to waste on something gloriously impractical. The harpsichord player begins a gentle piece, each note threading through the murmur of voices. The merchant circles the room like a conductor, subtly guiding guests toward the pineapple, ensuring each one gets their moment in front of it. You notice that no one lingers to long. It would be gauche to monopolize the fruit. Instead, they step aside for the next admirer, the way one might at a royal audience. Somewhere in the kitchen, you hear the sharp crack of sugar being broken for desserts. The smell of cinnamon drifts through the open doorway, but in the parlor, all eyes remained fixed on the crown of green leaves and the sunlit skin of the starguest. The evening settles into its rhythm, a slow-moving current of conversation, music, and delicate posturing. A lady in silver brocade recounts how she once saw a pineapple in Versailles. She adds, "It was slightly smaller than tonight's specimen." The merchant smiles politely, but you can see the glint in his eye. He knows his fruit is the finest in the room, possibly in the entire city tonight. A group gathers near the pedestal. One guest leans in so close you fear he might touch it. but he stops just short, tilting his head as though the pineapple might reveal some hidden truth if observed from the right angle. Another lady peers at it through a small tortoiseshell magnifying glass, murmuring something about the perfect geometry of nature. A servant refills your orgeat and offers a plate of tiny pastries shaped like seashells. They are buttery and sweet, but you notice that even the food seems like a distraction compared to the fruit's silent dominance in the room. Here's your obscure tidbit. Some Parisian hosts in this era would commission wax replicas of pineapples to keep on display long after the real fruit had been eaten or spoiled. These wax versions were painted so carefully that even close inspection couldn't reveal the difference, though one unlucky guest in 1762 reportedly tried to slice one, leading to what must have been a very awkward pause in conversation. Historians still debate whether the incident was a genuine mistake or an unsubtle critique of the host's pretensions. The merchant's teenage daughter, dressed in pale yellow satin, hovers at the edge of the group. Every so often, she glances toward the pineapple as though checking it hasn't vanished. It's her first time hosting such a fashionable gathering, and you can tell she's calculating her every word and gesture. The harpsichord music shifts into something livelier, and for a moment, the fruit is left alone. It sits on its pedestal in dignified stillness, basking in the final glow of daylight. You can almost imagine it knows exactly what it is, the most important guest in the room, the reason for every carriage in the courtyard, the silent arbiter of who belongs in this circle and who doesn't. And just outside, past the gate and into the street, a small boy pauses to peer through the bars. He can't see much, just a glimpse of golden skin and green leaves, but his eyes widen all the same. Inside, the guests continue to talk. Outside, the city carries on, mostly unaware that in this one bright room, a pineapple is holding court. Night has fully taken hold of Paris, and the glow from the merchant's windows spills into the courtyard like warm honey. Inside, the air hums with conversation, but the pace has slowed. Guests have settled into comfortable clusters, their voices softened by wine and the pleasant fatigue of sustained politeness. The harpsichord's last notes have faded, replaced by the clink of porcelain cups and the soft sigh of chairs being drawn closer. The pineapple remains at the center of it all, its crown now casting long, dramatic shadows against the white damask. A candle placed nearby flickers, catching the glossy pattern of the skin, so that it seems almost to ripple. The merchant has angled the light. Deliberately he knows how to keep an audience captive without uttering a word. You wander to the edge of the room, where a pair of guests debate the merits of actually tasting pineapple. One insists it is too coarse for refined palates, and should remain a visual pleasure. The other claims it is like eating sunshine, if sunshine were dusted with sugar. Neither has, in fact, eaten it. This is a recurring theme tonight. Here's your historical fact. When fresh pineapples were eaten in 18th century Paris, they were often sliced and served in porcelain dishes with ornate silver forks, never with the fingers. The fruit was cut so that its decorative potential lingered rings arranged in overlapping patterns, or wedges fanned out like a peacock's tail. Even in consumption, it had to remain art. At the far end of the room, the merchant tells a story about the fruit's journey, a week at sea from the Caribbean, then carefully cradled in straw through the ports of Nantes, then by carriage to Paris. Whether or not this exact pineapple endured that voyage is unclear, but no one interrupts to ask. Historians still debate whether such tales were meant to educate or simply to inflate the sense of rarity. From the kitchen comes the scent of candied citrus and warm pastry, a reminder that the night will end with actual food. Still, as you glance around the room, you see the same thing reflected in every guest's eyes. They are here for the pineapple, and everything else is merely set dressing. The dessert course begins with a rustle of anticipation, as trays of confections emerge from the kitchen like a slow parade. There are almond meringues, glazed fruit tarts, and tall spun sugar sculptures, shaped like urns and birds. They are greeted with polite murmurs, the kind reserved for fine wallpaper, pleasant, but not the main attraction. The pineapple remains untouched, its pedestal unbothered by the bustle around it. A few guests steal glances in its direction, as though half expecting it to have somehow changed during the meal. It hasn't, of course, but the light has shifted again. Now it glows from within, warmed by the candle's amber halo. One gentleman, emboldened by wine, begins to tell a very dramatic story about a dinner he attended in London, where the host actually sliced a pineapple in front of the guests. Gasps follow. A lady in rose silk fan whispers to her neighbor that such boldness is distinctly un-French, and perhaps best left across the channel. Here's your obscure tidbit. Some Parisian hosts would borrow a pineapple for multiple evenings, returning it to a supplier in the morning. These traveling fruits might spend a week or more being admired at different addresses, carefully turned to hide any bruises. Eventually, when the pineapple's career as a showpiece ended, it might be sold quietly to a cook for use in preserves. The merchant, perhaps sensing the room's rising curiosity, takes a slow walk toward the pedestal. Every head turns. For a moment, you think he might announce that the fruit will be served. But instead, he simply adjusts the angle of the dish by a few degrees. This minor action draws a murmur of approval, as though the pineapple's beauty has been subtly enhanced. The candied chestnuts are served. The wine glasses are refilled. The night moves on, and still, the pineapple sits unchallenged, uncut, and entirely in control of the evening. The air in the parlor has taken on that particular density it gets late in the evening, warm from candle flames, fragrant with beeswax and sugar, and softened by the hum of many overlapping voices. You shift in your seat, not from boredom, but from the slow, inevitable slide toward drowsiness that comes when everyone around you is speaking in measured tones about topics that barely matter. The pineapple continues to reign at the center of the room, the merchant hovering nearby like a priest guarding a relic. A pair of young men approach, clearly attempting to impress the women they've been speaking to all night. One begins explaining the scientific reason why pineapples grow crowns, comparing it to the feathers of a rooster. You are not entirely convinced by his analogy, and judging by her faintly raised eyebrow, neither is his companion. Here's your historical fact. By the 18th century, horticultural experiments in France had begun to produce pineapples in heated greenhouses, known as orangeries chaudes. These were extremely costly to operate, requiring constant stoking of coal or wood to keep the tropical plants alive through Paris winters. Only the wealthiest estates could afford them, making any homegrown pineapple a minor miracle and a major bragging right. A servant slips quietly past, replacing a guttering candle. You notice the merchant's daughter again, this time standing a little closer to the pedestal, her fan held in both hands like a shield. She catches your eye briefly, before turning her attention back to the pineapple. As if to ensure it hasn't been tampered with in the last 3 minutes, one of the guests begins a story about a pineapple carved into the stone gate of an English country house, meant to welcome travelers. Another guest scoffs gently, remarking that in Paris, such a display would be too obvious. A pineapple must be experienced in the right setting, under the right lighting, with the right people in attendance. Somewhere in the background, the harpsichord player has returned, the soft notes weaving a delicate net over the entire scene. You realize that for all the movement in the room, fans opening and closing, glasses being refilled, candle wicks trimmed, the fruit itself has not shifted so much as a millimeter. And somehow, that stillness makes it even more magnetic. By now, the gathering has reached that comfortable plateau where no one feels the need to impress quite as much. The guests have settled into slower conversation, laughter blooming here and there like small fireworks. You catch fragments of talk about the opera, the king's latest hunting trip, and, inevitably, the pineapple's rumored origins. One older gentleman, clearly relishing his role as a storyteller, claims the fruit was smuggled into France hidden in a barrel of sugar. A younger guest counters that it was carried on a velvet cushion the entire way from Nantes, never once exposed to common air. Historians still debate the plausibility of such tales, but tonight, no one bothers to check. Here's your obscure tidbit. In some portraits of the era, noble families would pose with a pineapple, even if they had never owned one, hiring a painter who kept a fruit in his studio precisely for that purpose. The painted pineapple was, in many ways, more enduring than the real one. A servant offers you a cup of warm, spiced wine. It's heavy with cinnamon and cloves, the kind of drink that makes the edges of the evening blur in the most pleasant way. Across the room, a lady in green satin leans toward the pineapple, as though confiding a secret to it. She steps back with a satisfied smile, perhaps convinced it has agreed with her. The merchant takes a turn round the room, stopping to exchange a few quiet words with each guest. His path inevitably leads him back to the pedestal, where he adjusts the folds of the damask cloth with the care of someone tucking in a sleeping child. Outside, through the tall windows, Paris is a shadowy maze of flickering lanterns and drifting fog. Inside, The pineapple glows in its little pool of candlelight, still untouched, still the unquestioned center of a night designed entirely for its benefit. The night has settled into its final, slow chapter. The candles have burned low, their wax pooling on silver holders shaped like curling leaves. The air is heavier now, scented with the mix of perfumes worn by the guests, floral, powdery, a faint hint of something musky, and, underneath it all, the unmistakable sweetness of the pineapple, subtle but present if you stand close enough. The merchant stands beside the pedestal once more, entertaining a final round of admirers. His voice is quieter now, but each word is still weighted with pride. He recounts again the fruit's rarity, its fragility, and the precise balance of heat and humidity required to keep it perfect. The repetition doesn't seem to bother anyone. In fact, it adds to the ritual. Here's your historical fact. In this period, the pineapple had become such a fixture of elite gatherings that it was even used as a motif in dinnerware. Porcelain plates, serving dishes, and teapots were decorated with painted pineapples, the image suggesting both hospitality and refined taste. Owning such a set, even without the actual fruit, was a subtle claim to fashionable knowledge. At the edge of the room, two guests are engaged in a low conversation about whether the pineapple will be cut tonight. One claims it would be wasteful, another insists it would be selfish not to share. You suspect neither opinion will matter in the end. The fruit's fate rests entirely with the merchant, who glances toward it with the satisfied look of someone who knows he's kept everyone guessing. The harpsichord player has stopped, replaced by the occasional pop of a candle wick and the soft clink of glass on porcelain. Someone laughs, a warm, unhurried sound, and for a moment, it feels like the entire room exhales together. The pineapple, of course, remains perfectly still, its crown catching the last threads of candlelight like a small green crown of its own. The merchant finally steps forward, drawing the attention of every guest without raising his voice. He thanks them for their presence, for their conversation, and for the honor they have done this humble fruit by granting it their company. There's a ripple of laughter, half at the joke, half at the fact that it's not entirely a joke. He places one hand lightly on the pedestal, the other gesturing toward the pineapple. For the briefest moment, you think he might announce its unveiling for dessert. Instead, he simply says that its beauty should endure a while longer, and that he will not cut it tonight. There's an audible sigh from some corners, relief from others. The pineapple's reign will continue. Here's your obscure tidbit. Wealthy hosts sometimes extended a pineapple's public life by carefully rotating it between gatherings over several days, timing its eventual slicing to coincide with the peak of its fragrance, both to impress and to ensure no one suspected it had grown stale. A few guests rise, preparing to leave. Carriages will be waiting in the street outside, their lamps glowing faintly through the mist. The merchant's daughter curtsies to each person in turn, her eyes darting back to the fruit after every farewell. It seems she's taken on its protection as a personal duty. The last of the wine is poured, the final pastries offered. The parlor is quieter now, voices dropping to near whispers, the sort of low, contented murmur that comes when everyone knows the night is ending. But no one is rushing it. As the final candle gutters, the pineapple sits in shadow for the first time all evening. Even without the light, it still holds its place in the center of the room, as if it has absorbed every glance, every whisper, every ounce of attention, and now keeps them tucked away in its golden skin. Outside, Paris waits, but in here, the fruit has had the last word, without ever speaking. The next morning, Paris wakes with its usual reluctance. The rain has returned, pattering softly against the windows of the merchant's house. Inside, the parlor still smells faintly of candle wax and sugared almonds, though the guests are gone and the chairs have been pushed back against the walls. The pedestal remains in place, and upon it the pineapple, unchanged but somehow more regal in the pale daylight. A maid enters to tidy the room, pausing for a moment to study the fruit. She leans in, inhales, and lets out the faintest sigh. You wonder if she is one of the few here who might actually get to taste it, should the merchant finally relent. She adjusts the damask cloth on the pedestal and moves on, leaving the pineapple to its solitude. Here is your historical fact. Pineapples could keep for several days, sometimes even weeks if handled carefully, but they were at their most fragrant and, thus, most valuable just before the point of over-ripening. Timing was everything, both for serving and for making the strongest impression. Through the tall windows, the street outside is a churn of wheels and hooves. The merchant appears, wearing a plain morning coat instead of the finery from the night before. He walks straight to the pedestal, studying the pineapple as if inspecting a prized horse. His hand hovers just above it, not touching. Perhaps he is calculating. One more night. 2. The decision is his alone, though you suspect he enjoys the suspense almost as much as the display. Somewhere deeper in the house, you hear the clatter of plates and the faint clink of porcelain breakfast being laid out. The pineapple remains untouched, a silent guest still holding court in an empty room. Historians still debate whether such fruits were ultimately eaten by the household or quietly passed to a less affluent relative for the final, private enjoyment. Either way, for now, the merchant seems content to let it rain just a little longer. Later that day, a smaller gathering assembles family members, a close friend or two, and the merchant's business associate from the docks. The mood is far more relaxed than last night, with coats hung loosely over chairbacks and cups of coffee in place of crystal wine glasses. The pineapple is still there, but today it is not the sole focus. It shares the room with practical matters. Ledgers on the sideboard, a plate of sliced bread, a map of shipping routes. Still, it draws glances. The merchant's young niece approaches it shyly, her small hand hovering just above the crown. Her mother pulls her back gently, murmuring that it's not ready yet. The girl looks puzzled, as though she half expected it to start speaking if she touched it. Here's your obscure tidbit. In some households, a pineapple was not eaten until it had been sketched or painted for the family's records, much like a portrait. The artist might even exaggerate the size or symmetry of the fruit, ensuring it appeared even more magnificent in memory than in reality. The business associate asks whether the merchant plans to keep the fruit for another showing. The merchant shrugs, his eyes flicking toward the window where the sky has turned brighter. Perhaps tomorrow, he says, or perhaps the day after. He likes the idea of letting it mature. The conversation drifts toward trade winds, tariffs, and a shipment of porcelain delayed by storms. But even in these practical talks, the pineapple seems to listen. You imagine it quietly approving of the mention of porcelain. It has spent its entire Parisian life resting on a fine porcelain dish. After all, by evening, the small group has dispersed. The merchant is left alone in the parlor, leaning back in his chair and sipping the last of the coffee. The pineapple glows faintly in the low light, its green crown like the crest of some tropical herald. The day ends as it began, with the fruit still untouched, still waiting, and still the most important presence in the room. 2 more days pass, and the pineapple is still holding its place. The weather has turned warmer, the air in the parlor carrying a faint, ripening sweetness that seems to deepen each time you walk in. The merchant notices it too. He lingers near the pedestal longer now, his gaze both admiring and appraising. Today, a painter arrives, a wiry man with a bundle of brushes, a folding easel, and the slightly distracted air of someone already composing the portrait in his mind. The merchant greets him with the enthusiasm usually reserved for a favored dinner guest. The pineapple, after all, must be immortalized before its beauty fades. Here's your historical fact. 18th century still life paintings often celebrated rare and imported foods, with pineapples appearing as a mark of cosmopolitan taste. Artists sometimes exaggerated their size or perfection, creating an idealized version more magnificent than anything nature had grown. The painter sets up by the tall window, arranging his tools with deliberate slowness. He tilts the pedestal slightly so the light falls across the pineapple's patterned skin, creating sharp little diamonds of shadow. The merchant stands behind him for a while, offering unsolicited advice about capturing the fragrance. The painter smiles politely, but doesn't look up from his work. Meanwhile, a servant dusts the sideboard, moving carefully so as not to disturb the scene. The merchant's daughter peers around the doorway, curious to see how the pineapple will look on canvas. Her eyes dart between the real fruit and the emerging brushstrokes, as though trying to decide which will be the truer likeness. Historians still debate how many of these portraits were sold or kept in private homes, but in this case, the painting is clearly destined for the merchant's own wallet, permanent. Reminder of his mastery over both commerce and fashion. By the time the painter leaves, the room smells faintly of linseed oil, the pineapple bathed in the mellow gold of late afternoon. It remains where it has always been, but now it exists twice, once in reality and once in art. The painting has been delivered, and the merchant hangs it himself, adjusting the frame until it sits exactly level above the mantel. Now the pineapple presides over the parlor twice, once in life, once in oil. Guests arriving today are greeted by both, and they can't help but compare. Most agree the painting makes the fruit look slightly larger, a compliment the merchant accepts with a modest nod. The pineapple itself is beginning to soften, though only slightly. Its scent is richer now, filling the space in a way that is impossible to ignore. The merchant notices the lingering glances from his visitors, the way conversation dips when someone drifts too close to the pedestal. Here's your obscure tidbit. When a pineapple was finally cut, it was sometimes treated almost like a sacrament. Slices would be served in the order of social rank, ensuring the most important guests tasted first. The portions were small, often no more than a bite or two, but the gesture was what mattered. A friend suggests, gently, that the time may have come. The merchant tilts his head, considering. Perhaps tomorrow, he says, or perhaps tonight, if the moment feels right. His daughter brightens at this, though she tries to hide her excitement behind the measured flutter of her fan. As the evening light fades, the parlor is lit once more with candles. The pineapple's skin glows in their flicker, the green of its crown deepening into shadow. The merchant sits back in his chair, sipping wine and watching his guests move about the room. The painting hangs above, its painted fruit forever at the peak of perfection, while the real one quietly ripens in the warmth. Outside, Paris is alive with the sounds of carts, laughter, and the distant call of a night watchman. Inside, the pineapple remains where it has always been, poised at the very edge of its long career as the most admired object in the room. The following night arrives warm and still, the kind of evening when the air inside the parlor feels close, almost conspiratorial. The merchant has invited only a handful of guests, those closest to him in business or friendship. The table is already set with porcelain plates, silver forks, and a small stack of linen napkins, folded with a precision usually reserved for royal visits. At the center of it all, of course, sits the pineapple. Its fragrance is unmistakable now, deep, honeyed, with a faint sharpness beneath, like a warning that its time is short. The merchant stands beside it, one hand resting lightly on the pedestal. He smiles, but his voice is softer than usual as he announces that the moment has come. There's no dramatic flourish, no fanfares, just a slow, careful lifting of the fruit from its porcelain dish. Here's your historical fact. When cutting a pineapple in 18th century Paris, the act itself was a performance. The knife was often silver, the slices laid out in a symmetrical pattern so that even in being consumed, the fruit's elegance remained intact. The merchant's daughter steps forward to assist, holding the dish steady as her father works the blade through the golden skin. The guests lean in, the room hushed, except for the gentle scrape of the knife. Thin wedges are arranged on the plate, their pale flesh gleaming in the candlelight. Here's your obscure tidbit. In some households, the core of the pineapple, the firm, fibrous center, was not discarded but steeped in brandy for weeks afterward, creating a sweet liqueur that extended the fruit's presence long past its physical life. Each guest receives a small portion, no more than 2 bites. The merchant is last to take his, savoring it slowly, as though committing both taste and moment to memory. The pineapple, after weeks of silent rule, is finally part of the gathering in the most literal sense. Outside, the night presses close against the windows, the city's noises softened to a distant hum. Inside, there is laughter, quiet at first, then growing, as though everyone feels lighter now that the fruit's long vigil has ended. The day begins with the sound of water, soft, steady, the kind that creeps in at the edges of your thoughts before you're fully awake. You're standing on a riverbank, and the air is cool in that way that promises the sun will eventually win but isn't in any rush. The light is pale and clear, turning the ripples into ribbons of silver. Somewhere far off, a heron calls, its voice flat and ancient. You probably won't make it through this day, but that's all right. This particular river has been rearranging itself for centuries and will not be offended if you drift off mid-story. Before we wander further, if the idea of quietly trailing a river god through the slow business of his immortal errands sounds like your kind of evening, you can like and subscribe. It helps me keep telling these meandering tales without needing to sell river gravel on the side. And, if your eyes aren't yet drooping, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and your local time. I'll picture it in my head and nod with exaggerated wisdom. Now, let's ease into tonight's journey. You take a step down onto the damp stones, feeling the cool grit under your sandals. The river you've come to see today is not just any stretch of water, belongs to Scamander, a river god of ancient Greek myth. known for his stubborn personality and his habit of moving himself around, literally, while other rivers seemed content with the paths the earth gave them. Scamander was famous for shifting his course whenever it suited him. Here's your historical fact. In the Iliad, Homer mentions Scamander as the river that fought on the side of the Trojans, even clashing directly with Achilles when the hero's battle frenzy clogged the river with too many bodies. This is perhaps the least relaxing part of Scamander's resume, so we'll keep that firmly in the background for tonight. A fisherman sits nearby, mending a net with fingers that look as knotted as the rope he's working. He tells you, with the casual certainty of someone repeating a story passed down for generations, that Scamander changes his banks at least once every few decades. Sometimes he does it out of spite, sometimes out of boredom, and occasionally according to local gossipy cause. He simply doesn't like how the sunlight hits the water in the afternoon. Historians still debate whether tales of Scamander's shifting course reflect actual changes in the river's path over centuries, or if the Greeks just enjoyed the idea of a god with the same petty whims as a neighbor moving furniture at odd hours. You walk along the bank, noticing the plants here seem to grow at peculiar angles, as if they've had to adapt to the river's wandering ways. Willow roots dangle in the current, trailing like long green hair. Scamander himself is nowhere to be seen yet, but you have the distinct feeling he's watching, perhaps from beneath the surface, perhaps from somewhere downstream, rearranging a bend just to see if you'll notice. The current is gentle, the air damp with the scent of moss and clay, and your steps slow until the world around you feels like it's moving at the river's pace. You follow the curve of the water, and soon the sound of the current deepens, folding over rocks hidden beneath the surface. Scamander appears, or rather, he emerges, a tall figure rising from the river, as if it was simply the hem of his robe. His hair hangs long and wet, threaded with reeds, and his eyes have that glint of someone who knows exactly how much trouble he's capable of causing, but isn't currently in the mood to prove it. He greets you without words, only a nod, and continues his work, pushing at the riverbed with a long staff carved from driftwood. The water shifts at his touch, a lazy eddy curling toward the opposite bank. It's a process both deliberate and oddly casual, like someone rearranging the cushions on a couch they've owned for centuries. Here's your obscure tidbit. In some local traditions, Scamander was said to have two names, his divine one, Scamander, and his mortal one, Xanthus. Which he preferred seems to have depended entirely on who was asking and whether they had brought him an offering. The god pauses, leaning on his staff, and you notice that the bank he walked along earlier already looks different, the slope gentler, the curve wider. He catches your glance and smirks, the kind of smirk that says, "Yes, I did that while you were blinking." A shepherd arrives, leading a small flock to drink at the shallows. He greets the river god with the polite deference you'd offer someone who could flood your pasture, just to make a point. Scamander allows the sheep to drink undisturbed, though you notice he shifts a small stone in the current, so that the water forms a perfect ripple around their legs. Historians still debate whether such myths of river gods working the landscape were poetic ways to explain natural erosion and sediment buildup, or if they reflected a more personal relationship people imagined having with their environment. You sit on a smooth rock, watching the slow choreography of water and earth. Scamander hums a low, tuneless melody, and the current seems to sway with it. Time here feels stretched thin, like sunlight across a long afternoon, and you realize that this watching a god rearrange his banks is probably the most unhurried form of divine labor you're ever likely to see. The god glances upstream, as if considering his next adjustment, and you find yourself wondering what this place will look like tomorrow, or in 100 years after he's finished with it. You leave your perch on the rock and follow Scamander as he wades upstream, the hem of his watery robe blending seamlessly into the current. The river here narrows, the banks rising in soft green slopes patched with wildflowers. Scamander moves with the confidence of someone who knows every stone beneath the surface, every root that has reached down to sip from his waters. As you walk, you pass a cluster of olive trees leaning at odd angles. Their roots cling to the soil like stubborn fingers, half exposed where the river has eaten away the earth. Scamander notices your glance and shrugs, as though to say, they'll adapt or they won't. You get the impression this is his general philosophy on landscaping. Here's your historical fact. In ancient Greek culture, rivers weren't just bodies of water, they were sacred boundaries, sources of fertility, and often central to local identity. Entire cities were named for the rivers that sustained them, and crossing one without proper ritual could be seen as an offense to the god who ruled it. A fisherman waves from a little skiff anchored near the opposite bank. He calls out that the sandbar he's been fishing from has moved again. Scamander grins, clearly pleased with himself. You suspect this fisherman has learned to treat the river's rearrangements as a kind of seasonal surprise, sometimes a blessing, sometimes an inconvenience, and occasionally a reason to invent new curse words. Here's your obscure tidbit. In certain parts of Anatolia, smaller rivers were believed to visit larger ones by briefly changing their course, almost like polite guests stopping by for gossip. Scamander, of course, prefers to have visitors rather than be one himself. Historians still debate whether these stories came from observing rare natural events like flash floods and avulsions, or if they were simply the product of riverside imagination. You continue upstream until the path becomes a tangle of reeds and tall grass. Scamander pushes them aside with his staff, the water swirling around your ankles now. He stops at a bend where the bank curves sharply, tapping the riverbed with the end of his staff. The current begins to shift, subtle at first, then more pronounced, pulling toward a new channel he's decided to carve. It's a slow process, but there's something hypnotic about the deliberate way he moves the water, the almost imperceptible rearranging of the bank. Watching Scamander at work feels a bit like watching a potter shape clay, only the clay flows, and sometimes floods your neighbor's vegetable garden. You spend the next stretch of the day in a quiet rhythm. Scamander adjusts a section of bank. You follow along, occasionally stepping aside for a shepherd or fisherman passing by. The sun climbs higher, warm enough now that the air smells faintly of warm stone and crushed grass. The river god hums again, a tune that might be as old as the river itself, though it drifts in and out of something you could almost call lazy whistling. At one point, you reach a spot where the bank has been neatly lined with flat stones, clearly arranged by human hands. Scamander studies it with narrowed eyes, as if assessing a child's attempt at imitating his craft. With a flick of his staff, he lets the water lap just a little higher over the edge, enough to unsettle one stone from its place. He catches your look and mutters something that could be translated as, "It's an improvement." Here's your historical fact. In Homeric times, Scamander's waters were considered especially pure, and certain rituals involved drawing water from his river for cleansing before sacrifices. This purity was as much a political point as a religious one. It tied the people living along his banks to the god's goodwill. Nearby, a group of children are skipping flat stones across the surface. Scamander lets the first few fly without comment, but when one particularly good throw makes a stone hop all the way to midstream, he raises an eyebrow and subtly shifts the current to carry it further. The children cheer, assuming their skill is unmatched, and run off to boast about it. Here's your obscure tidbit. There was once a local festival along Scamander's banks where villagers would set tiny reed boats afloat, each carrying a little clay figure meant to represent themselves. The goal was for the river to accept your offering by carrying it around the bend without tipping it over. Scamander never says if he played favorites, but you suspect he did. Historians still debate whether this festival was purely symbolic or if it had ties to actual navigation rights for new sailors. The afternoon light takes on a heavier gold, shadows lengthening across the water. Scamander slows his pace, leaning more on his staff, and finally stops at a shallow stretch where the current is calm. He kneels, runs his fingers through the water, and lets it slip away between them. It's an oddly human gesture, one that makes you think he isn't just moving the river for its own sake, but because he simply likes the way it feels to shape the world a little at a time. You wake from a brief unplanned nap against a sun-warmed boulder to find Scamander standing midstream, waist-deep in his own waters, studying the far bank as though it has personally offended him. The sun is lower now, the air carrying that late-day softness that makes every sound feel rounder, slower. A breeze stirs the reeds, making a sound like pages turning in an old book. He raises his staff, points toward a clump of willow roots dangling into the water, and shakes his head. You get the sense this is the river god's equivalent of sighing at a crooked picture frame. Without a word, he steps toward the bank, pressing the current until the roots sway differently, reshaping the little inlet that cradles them. Here's your historical fact. In Greek epic tradition, river gods were often depicted as powerful but highly local deities. They rarely meddled far from their own waters. Scamander's influence stopped where his stream did, which perhaps explains why he put so much attention into the land and banks he could reach. From the path above, a farmer calls down, asking Scamander not to flood the lower meadow again this season. Scamander waves without making promises. You suspect this is an ongoing negotiation, one in which the farmer has no real leverage beyond polite requests and a good pear harvest as an occasional bribe. Here's your obscure tidbit. Certain coastal towns held annual bank straightening ceremonies, where locals would haul stones and pack mud along the river's edge to help their god. Scamander reportedly undid this work within a fortnight, allegedly claiming the river shouldn't look like a corridor. Historians still debate whether such interventions actually made any difference to the river's long-term path, or if they were mostly social events disguised as civic duty. By now, the sun has dipped low enough that the water reflects more shadow than sky. Scamander finishes smoothing the inlet and glances downstream, as if mentally arranging his to-do list for tomorrow. You follow his gaze and see nothing unusual, just the same looping bends you walked earlier. But you know by now that the god is already imagining them differently. Evening settles over the river in slow, deliberate layers. The heat of the day leaches from the stones under your feet, replaced by the damp chill that creeps in from the water. Scamander moves toward a wide, still pool, bordered by rushes. The air here smells faintly of mint, and when you step closer, you see small white blossoms floating at the edge like bits of spilled moonlight. He sets his staff aside and lowers himself into the pool until only his shoulders and head remain above the surface. The water doesn't so much ripple as shift around him, like fabric being rearranged. You sit nearby, the sound of frogs starting their night chorus settling into the spaces between your thoughts. Here's your historical fact. Scamander Springs was said to be warm in winter and cool in summer, a sign of divine control over temperature that made his waters especially prized for both ritual bathing and practical use. A young woman arrives carrying a clay jug. She kneels at the bank, filling it from the stillest part of the pool. Scamander watches her with mild curiosity. When she's done, she thanks him under her breath, a gesture so casual and unself-conscious. You realize this is simply how people here treat their god. As a neighbor you greet without ceremony, but always with respect. Here's your obscure tidbit. In some tellings, Scamander was thought to occasionally change the flavor of his water to signal displeasure, turning it brackish for a day or two. No one agrees whether this was deliberate or the result of natural shifts, but the belief was enough to make locals quick to offer apologies after offending him. Historians still debate whether such water moods were recorded observations of environmental changes or purely mythological warnings dressed up as folk science. The light fades to blue, the first stars sliding into place above the water. Scamander leans back, letting the current carry his hair downstream. He doesn't speak, and neither do you. There's no need, the river is loud enough without words, and the night has only just begun to stretch itself across the banks. Night deepens, and with it the river takes on an entirely different voice. What had been a gentle murmur in the daylight becomes a low, steady hush, the kind of sound that seems to curl around your ears and slow your breathing. Scamander rises from the pool, water streaming from his robes and hair, each droplet catching what little moonlight makes it through the reeds. He walks along the bank now, his bare feet sinking slightly into the damp earth. You trail behind, stepping carefully to avoid the slick patches where moss grows thick. Fireflies drift in the air like wandering sparks, their reflections dancing in the black surface of the water. Scamander pauses to watch them, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, as if even a god can still be impressed by something that glows for no reason except that it can. Here's your historical fact. The Scamander River, known today as the Karamandas in modern Turkey, runs near the site of ancient Troy. For the Greeks, it wasn't just a geographical feature but part of the epic landscape of the Trojan War. Its association with Homeric legend made it both a real river and a mythic one. A faint splash draws your attention. Scamander has tossed a smooth stone into the current, watching the ripples push outward. Then, with a twist of his staff, he sends those ripples curling back toward him. The circles tighten until they vanish entirely, as though the stone had never fallen at all. A bit of divine sleight of hand, performed for no audience but you. Here's your obscure tidbit. Some ancient poets claimed river gods could store moments in their waters, images, sounds, even scents that could later be released. These memories weren't shared willingly, but rather spilled out during floods or droughts, when the river's control loosened. Scamander doesn't confirm this, but the way he glances at you just now feels like he's holding back a secret. Historians still debate whether such beliefs were tied to actual flood phenomena objects, carried downstream suddenly resurfacing, or if they were simply a poetic way to describe a river's unpredictability. You reach a place where the moon reflects perfectly in the water, unbroken and bright. Scamander stops here, leaning on his staff, his gaze fixed not on the moon itself, but on how it wavers when a faint breeze brushes the surface. He seems pleased. Perhaps this too is part of his endless rearranging, making sure even the moon's reflection sits just so. The walk continues under a sky deep enough to feel infinite. Scamander turns toward a narrower channel where the current moves more quickly, hissing softly as it slips past the stones. You follow along the raised edge, where grasses bend, toward the water as though straining to hear what it's saying. A fox darts from the shadows, pauses at the bank, and drinks. Scamander doesn't move, letting the animal take its fill. You realize he's as careful with the river's smaller visitors as with its human ones, though you suspect, if the fox started digging in the wrong spot, he'd redirect the current just to make a point. Here's your historical fact. In Greek art, river gods were often depicted as reclining figures, usually bearded, with one arm resting on an urn from which water flowed. This image wasn't meant to capture their constant activity either. It symbolized their eternal nature, as if the river's work was effortless. Scamander clearly missed that memo. You pass a section of bank where the earth has crumbled, leaving a fresh cut of raw soil. Scamander eyes it critically, then sweeps his staff through the water. The current shifts, curling into the exposed edge like a craftsman tracing a seam. You watch as the water smooths the cut into a gentler slope, the kind you've seen elsewhere along his banks. Here's your obscure tidbit. A few late Hellenistic writers claimed Scamander was prone to moods, where he preferred one bank over the other, sending more water to one side for weeks or months at a time. Farmers learned to plant accordingly, though this may have been less divine whim, and more the result of seasonal rains. Historians still debate whether such stories were exaggerated to explain crop successes and failures, or whether they reflected a real, observed pattern in the river's flow. The night air grows cooler, scented with damp reeds and the faint mineral temps of the water. Scamander finally stops, planting his staff in the riverbed and leaning on it like a man who's found the exact place he wanted to reach. The current hums around him, steady and strong. He glances over his shoulder at you, not smiling, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who knows the river is exactly as it should be, at least until tomorrow, when he'll start changing it all over again. The dawn comes slowly here, as though even the sun is reluctant to hurry the river along. A pale wash of light brushes the tops of the reeds first, then creeps down to the water, catching on the ripples and silvery flashes. Scamander is already awake, or maybe he never sleeps standing, ankle-deep at the edge of a shallow ford. You join him, the water cool and smooth over your feet. He's studying the stones beneath the surface, crouching to pick one up, then tossing it aside with no ceremony. The chosen stone, apparently, is the one he keeps, placing it carefully in a little cluster. From the pattern, you realize he's building something, perhaps a guide for the current, or perhaps a shape only he can recognize. Here's your historical fact. In the Homeric tradition, Scamander is one of the few natural features given agency in battle. During the Trojan War, when Achilles choked the river with fallen soldiers, Scamander rose in a wave to attack him directly, nearly drowning the hero. The idea of a river god as an active combatant was unusual, and it cemented his reputation as a figure not to be crossed. A farmer appears on the opposite bank, balancing a basket of figs on his shoulder. He calls across, asking if the ford will still be passable after the next rain. Scamander raises a hand in vague assurance, though given what you've seen of his habits, this probably means, it depends on my mood. Here's your obscure tidbit. Some ancient storytellers insisted Scamander's waters turned warm when he was pleased, and cold when angered. Locals claimed they could read his temperament just by dipping a hand in the stream. Whether this was seasonal change or supernatural sulking remains uncertain. Historians still debate if such stories had any basis in thermal springs connected to the river, or if it was all a matter of poetic interpretation. The light strengthens, the air warming by degrees. Scamander finishes arranging his little cluster of stones, steps back, and nods to himself. You can't tell if he's solved a grand hydraulic puzzle or simply satisfied an itch for symmetry. Either way, the current adjusts, curling softly around his handiwork, as though acknowledging its maker. By mid-morning the river is busy, not in the frantic city street sense, but in the way a river hums with quiet errands. A pair of fishermen stand knee-deep downstream, casting their nets in slow arcs. A group of children chase each other along the bank, daring each other to leap from one flat stone to the next. Scamander watches it all with the calm air of someone who's seen these games for 1,000 summers. You notice he has taken to walking with his staff, dragging lightly in the water, leaving a faint wake that lingers long after he's passed. Every so often he pauses to lift the staff and draw a small spiral in the current, an idle habit, perhaps, or some subtle way of marking the water. Here's your historical fact. The Scamander was not just a waterway for the Trojans, it was a lifeline. Its waters irrigated fields, supported fishing, and served as a gathering place for trade. Entire villages relied on its steady flow, making Scamander a god whose moods had direct, tangible effects on daily survival. An old woman approaches with a reed basket filled with herbs. She squats at the edge to rinse them, greeting Scamander as casually as she might a neighbor. He responds by shifting a trickle of water toward her, making the rinsing easier. It's a small act, but it tells you everything about his relationship with the people here, neither distant nor overly familiar, but present in the rhythms of their lives. Here's your obscure tidbit. Certain festival days were marked by floating wreaths of laurel or olive down the river as offerings. The direction and speed of their travel were read as omens. Swift passage meant good fortune, while a wreath that spun in place was considered a warning. Scamander, of course, could control this entirely, though whether he ever played with the results is anyone's guess. Historians still debate whether such rituals had religious origins or began as simple river games that later gained symbolic meaning. The sun is high now, and the water glitters with shifting patterns of gold and blue. Scamander stops midstream, closes his eyes, and lets the current pull gently against him. You get the sense that for all his rearranging, this might be his favorite part of the day, the quiet moments when the river simply runs, and he can just be part of it. The afternoon heat settles in like a heavy blanket, and the air along the river grows thick with the smell of sun-warmed reeds. Scamander moves more slowly now, favoring the shade of leaning willow branches. You follow him under one such canopy, where the water grows darker, flecked with drifting leaves that spin lazily before sinking out of sight. He stoops to lift one of the longer branches, letting it sweep across the water's surface. The ripples radiate outward in perfect circles, and you have the distinct feeling he's not doing this idly. He's measuring something, testing how the current behaves under the willow's reach. Here's your historical fact. Rivers like Scamander were often seen as the dividing lines between worlds, sometimes between the living and the dead, sometimes between neighboring territories. In certain Greek traditions, crossing a river without the proper rites was thought to bring bad luck or draw the gods' irritation. A boy wades out from the shallows with a clay jug, clearly sent to fetch water. Scamander watches him closely, then sends a small, playful surge that rocks the boy's feet, just enough to make him laugh but not spill the jug. You suspect this is his version of saying hello. Here's your obscure tidbit. Some ancient households kept a small jar of river water indoors, refreshed weekly, as a sign of ongoing favor from the local god. In Scamander's case, the story goes that if the water turned cloudy before its time, it meant he disapproved of something the household had done. Historians still debate whether such practices were widespread, religious customs or localized habits that became exaggerated in The afternoon sun filters through the willow leaves in shifting lattice of light and shade. Scamander leans on his staff, watching the patterns move across the water. The whole scene feels like it might stay exactly this way for 100 years, until you remember who you're dealing with, and realize he'll probably change it by tomorrow. Later, the river widens into a shallow basin, the water spreading thin over a bed of pale sand. Scamander steps into it without hesitation, his robes fanning around him like drifting clouds. You join him, the sand firm but smooth under your feet. The water so clear you can see tiny fish flicking in and out of the sunlight. He begins rearranging the sand with the end of his staff, pushing it into low ridges and channels. The work is so meticulous that you can't help but think of a monk raking a Zen garden. When he's finished, the current moves differently, softer in some places, quicker in others, as though he's conducting a symphony you can only half hear. Here's your historical fact. In addition to being tied to the Trojan War in myth, Scamander's river was a vital artery for trade in the region. Small boats carried goods between inland farms and the coast. Relying on the river's predictable depth and course, something Scamander was not always inclined to guarantee. A merchant arrives on the far shore, unloading amphorae from a flat-bottomed boat. He pauses to bow towards Scamander, then hurries to set his cargo on dry ground. You notice that the god subtly deepens the channel beneath the boat, making the return journey easier. It's a quiet transaction, an exchange of respect for safe passage. Here's your obscure tidbit. A few ancient hymns describe river gods as having second mouths, secret inlets or springs that only they could open. These hidden flows were said to appear suddenly during drought, providing water to those who had honored the god faithfully. Historians still debate whether such tales were inspired by genuine hydrological quirks, like seasonal springs, or were entirely symbolic gestures in myth. By now the heat has softened, replaced by the kind of warm breeze that carries the smell of distant fields. Scamander steps back from his sand patterns, satisfied, and lets the current take over again. The fish return, darting between the ridges as if they'd been waiting for this rearrangement all along. The day tilts toward evening again, and the light along the river turns a softer gold, the kind that seems to stick to every surface it touches. Scamander is walking more slowly now, his staff resting against his shoulder, as if the work of shifting banks and coaxing currents has been enough for one day. You follow a little behind, letting the hum of insects and the low rush of water fill the space between steps. He stops at a bend where the river presses close against a steep bank of clay. You can see where chunks have broken away recently, leaving raw streaks of red and brown. Scamander kneels and presses a palm flat against the wet clay, the water behind him pulling slightly, as though leaning in to hear his thoughts. Here's your historical fact. In the Iliad, Scamander is one of the few gods who directly confronts a mortal hero Achilles, and not out of vengeance or rivalry, but simply because the hero's actions disrupted the river's flow. This made Scamander unique. His anger wasn't about politics or pride, but about the balance of his own domain. A pair of herons stand nearby, motionless except for the occasional tilt of their long beaks toward the shallows. Scamander glances at them, then nudges the current so a small fish darts into range. One heron strikes, quick and precise. The other just stares at the water, either patient or slow to learn. Here's your obscure tidbit. Some small shrines to Scamander reportedly stood not on the river's banks, but slightly inland, close enough to see the water, far enough to avoid seasonal floods. Offerings left at these shrines included woven river reeds, shaped into simple knots or loops. Historians still debate whether these inland shrines were meant for convenience, practicality, or because certain stretches of the river were considered more sacred than others. The clay bank seems unchanged when Scamander stands again, but you notice the current curling differently at its base, carrying silt away in a cleaner arc. The herons shift their weight, perhaps sensing the new flow. Scamander walks on, and you follow, wondering how many such subtle changes you've already missed today. The sky begins to layer itself in blue and rose, the first hints of night pushing at the edges. Scamander leads you to a wide, calm reach of water that mirrors the sky so perfectly it feels like you're walking into a painting. The surface is broken only by the occasional ring of a fish rising for insects. He stops near a flat-topped boulder that juts into the current and sits, motioning for you to do the same. From here you can see both banks, clearly the low, sandy stretch on one side, the taller, tree-lined slope on the other. Scamander gestures toward each in turn, as though comparing them like a craftsman considering two versions of the same design. Here's your historical fact. Rivers in the ancient world were often seen as living maps. Their bends, crossings, and tributaries defined political borders and trade routes. To alter a river's course even slightly was to redraw the lines of human territory, whether intentionally or not. A fisherman's voice carries over the water, humming a tune that seems older than the words themselves. Scamander listens for a while, then hums along in a lower register, the sound blending with the rush of the current until it's impossible to tell where voice ends and river begins. Here's your obscure tidbit. There are scattered references to river gods teaching songs to mortals, often in dreams. These melodies were said to carry the rhythm of the river itself, though whether anyone could hear the difference between divine composition and a regular folk song is unclear. Historians still debate whether these accounts were poetic metaphor or genuine belief in divine music. The sun finally slips below the horizon, and the river's mirrored surface darkens to glassy black. Scamander rises, brushing his palms against his robe, and steps back into the water. The current closes around him like an old friend. He doesn't say where he's going, but you have the sense that this part of the river is ready to be left alone for the night at least until he decides to change it again tomorrow. Night folds itself fully over the river, each sound sharpening in the cool air. The steady hush of water blends with the soft rustle of reeds and the occasional plop of a frog slipping from bank to stream. Scamander walks ahead in a slow, unhurried path, his silhouette a moving shadow against the faint silver light on the water. You follow him to a quiet meander, where the current curves lazily and the banks slope gently down to the water's edge. Here, he stops. There's no rearranging tonight, no shifting of sandbars or careful nudging of stones. Instead, he plants his staff in the shallows, rests both hands on the top, and simply looks out across the dark water. Here's your historical fact. Rivers like Scamander were not only worshipped, but also woven into the practical calendars of the people who lived beside them. Flood cycles, planting seasons, and even local festivals moved in time with the water's rhythms. In this sense, Scamander's moods were less divine quirk and more a mirror of nature's patterns. A faint ripple passes in front of you. For a moment, you imagine the river itself breathing, slow and deep. Scamander tilts his head slightly, as though he hears something far off. You realize it's the low hoot of an owl somewhere across the fields. He listens until the sound fades, then exhales, though whether it's contentment or a signal to move on, you can't tell. Here's your obscure tidbit. Certain poets claimed that river gods could dream, and that their dreams shaped the landscape. A bend in the river might be the memory of a dream, while a sudden new channel was the god's restless tossing in his sleep. Historians still debate whether this imagery was purely metaphor, or if it hinted at an early understanding of how floods and erosion create new waterways. Scamander finally turns back to you, his eyes reflecting faint moonlight, and gestures downstream. You both walk in silence, the night air cooling your skin, until the sound of the current becomes the only thing you're aware of. The first sound you hear is not the Nile, not the wind, but the dull thump of a baker's paddle against the side of a clay oven. It's a sound that's been repeated here for centuries, so familiar that no one notices it anymore, except you, the newcomer. The air smells faintly of yeast, barley, and wood smoke, with an undercurrent of warm dust that clings to your clothes before you even step fully into the bakery courtyard. You're in Thebes, sometime during the reign of Amenhotep III, when the sun god still receives daily offerings, and bread is not just food, it's currency, ritual, and a small work of art. You probably won't make it through this day without eating something shaped like a bird, but that's all right. Everyone else is doing it too. Before we wander any further, I'll gently remind you, if the thought of warm loaves in a cool ancient courtyard makes you want more quiet history in your evenings, you can like and subscribe. It's free, and it keeps me from having to barter bread-shaped ducks for rent. And if your eyelids aren't already half closed, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I'll picture it, probably with you holding a snack. Now let's ease into tonight's journey. You step through a low doorway into the bakery's workroom. The floor is hard-packed clay, the walls pale and smooth, with shelves cut directly into them for baskets and tools. In the center, a long wooden table is dusted with flour in uneven handprints. 3 bakers stand side by side, rolling and shaping dough with a speed that suggests muscle memory more than conscious thought. Here's your historical fact. Ancient Egyptian bread came in hundreds of shapes, from simple round loaves to elaborate forms shaped like animals, flowers, and even temple offerings. These weren't just decorative, many of them carried symbolic meaning in religious ceremonies, especially the ones shaped like ducks or geese. One baker glances at you and, without breaking rhythm, begins to pinch and curve the dough in his hands, until it looks uncannily like a small bird. Mid-swim, he places it gently on a reed mat, where dozens of other dough ducks wait their turn in the oven. Here's your obscure tidbit. In some temple kitchens, bakers made bread in the shape of a duck, not just for visual charm, but to feed statues of deities during festivals. These breads might be brushed with honey or date syrup, so they glistened like the feathers of a real bird. Historians still debate whether these animal-shaped loaves were eaten after the ceremonies or left to crumble, as offerings, a detail the surviving records don't bother to clarify, possibly because no one imagined people in the future would care. In the corner, a boy fans the mouth of a beehive-shaped oven with a palm frond, coaxing the heat to stay even. The room is warm, but not stifling, the heat escaping through a small vent above. The smell is rich, now sweet barley, a hint of caraway, and the faint singe of dough touching hot clay. Somewhere outside, a donkey brays, and one of the bakers mutters under his breath. You imagine the bred ducks are safe from the animal. Probably. You follow one of the bakers out into the sunlight, where the heat is sharper, bouncing up from the pale stone courtyard. A reed mat has been spread across the ground, covered with freshly baked loaves cooling in the open air. The duck-shaped breads are smaller than you expected, each about the size of your palm. Their edges browned, just enough to give them definition. The baker picks one up, taps the bottom to test for hollowness, and nods approvingly. He sets it back down among its flock. Yes, that's the only way to describe the sonbi, for turning to tend a larger loaf, shaped like a lotus blossom. Here's your historical fact. Bread was a staple in the Egyptian diet, made primarily from emmer wheat or barley. The baking process was so central to daily life that many tomb paintings include scenes of bread making, ensuring the deceased would have eternal loaves in the afterlife. The baker gestures for you to take one of the duck loaves. The crust is firm, but the inside is soft and slightly dense, with a warm, nutty scent. You tear off a piece. It's chewy, with a subtle sweetness from the grain. You can see why these were worth offering to the gods. They taste like comfort, even after a morning in the sun. Here's your obscure tidbit. In wealthier households, decorative breads might be dusted with finely ground spices, or even flecked with precious metals, like gold leaf during festivals. While edible, these were more a statement of status than a culinary choice, though no doubt someone tried eating one, just to say they had. Historians still debate whether the intricate shapes were crafted solely for ceremonial use, or if they were common at large public feasts. The truth is likely somewhere in between. Bread for sustenance most days, bread as art on the days that mattered. A woman arrives from the street, balancing a basket on her head. She exchanges a few coins for a small bundle of the duck-shaped breads, wrapping them in linen. As she leaves, you notice her heading toward the temple down the road, where the faint hum of chanting drifts over the rooftops. The baker returns to his workroom, leaving you in the courtyard with the warm smell of grain, the quiet flutter of palm leaves in the breeze, and a small, golden-brown duck loaf resting in your hand. You turn it over, admiring the care in its curves, wondering if the gods notice the details as much as you do. The morning shadows are beginning to shrink, retreating toward the cool edges of the buildings. You wander down the narrow street, duck loaf still in hand, past the painted mud brick walls that separate the bakery quarter from the busier market lanes. The air here smells different, less of grain, more of fish and river mud drifting up from the harbor. Ahead, a row of stalls offers everything from clay oil lamps to linen scarves dyed in deep indigo. But the real magnet is the bread vendor halfway down, his table stacked with loaves shaped into crocodiles, ibises, and Dismore ducks. Apparently, this is the shape of the season. Here's your historical fact. Bread stalls in ancient Egypt were common fixtures in markets, often selling not just plain loaves but specialty shapes to travelers, merchants, and festival goers. For larger events, these breads could be pre-ordered in bulk, making them an early form of catering. The vendor waves you over, clearly recognizing the bakery's handiwork. He points at your duck loaf and raises an eyebrow in mock appraisal, as if checking for quality. Then he picks up one of his own loaves, a crocodile, with a surprisingly friendly face, and presses it into your hands. Here's your obscure tidbit. In some temple festivals, bread animals were used in processions before being broken apart and shared among the attendees. The symbolism varied. A bread crocodile might honor Sobek, the crocodile god, while a duck-shaped loaf could be an offering to a fertility deity or simply a nod to the Nile's abundant bird life. Historians still debate whether such breads were eaten with reverence or with the casual joy of biting the head off a cookie. The paintings don't exactly show chewing techniques. You take a bite of the crocodile loaf. It's lighter than the duck, with a faint hint of fennel. A child nearby points at it and giggles, maybe imagining the real animal in the river. The vendor winks at you, then turns back to arranging his breads into neat rows, each one a small sculpture waiting for its buyer. The street continues ahead, sunlight pooling on its worn flagstones. Somewhere, a drum begins to beat in slow, steady rhythm. You follow the sound, carrying your two bread animals like odd trophies. The drumbeat leads you to a shaded square where a small crowd has gathered. In the center, a man kneels beside a low altar draped in linen. On the altar sit offerings, flowers, jars of beer, and, no surprise, bread shaped like ducks. A scribe nearby is recording the event on a strip of papyrus, his reed pen scratching softly. Here's your historical fact. Bread was one of the most common offerings in Egyptian religion, appearing in temple rituals, funerary rites, and seasonal festivals. Its value wasn't just nutritional, it symbolized life, abundance, and the stability of the agricultural cycle. The kneeling man picks up one of the bread ducks and holds it out toward the statue on the altar, a seated figure of a goddess with a bird's head, her gilded features catching the shifting light. After a quiet prayer, he sets the loaf down again, arranging it so the beak points toward the statue. Here's your obscure tidbit. Certain temples kept detailed records of bread offerings, not just in quantity but in shape and style. In some cases, these records show a surprising level of micromanagement: orders for 10 ducks, 3 fish, and 1 crocodile for a single day's rites. Historians still debate whether these shapes were chosen for specific symbolic purposes or simply reflected what the bakers were most skilled at making on short notice. The air in the square is thick with the smell of incense, mixing with the yeasty warmth of the bread. A young acolyte approaches, offering you a cup of beer, lightly sour, slightly sweet. You take a sip and feel the coolness spread down your throat, the taste familiar yet faintly earthy. Around you, the crowd begins to disperse. The offering complete, the statue remains still, its golden paint catching the afternoon sun, while the bread ducks rest quietly at its feet. You glance down at your own loaves, suddenly unsure whether you're supposed to eat them or find a small altar of your own. You leave the square with the crowd, drifting back into the rhythm of the street. The sound of the drum fades, replaced by the chatter of merchants, hawking spices, papyrus scrolls, and baskets of dried figs. The Nile's breeze sneaks between the buildings here, carrying the faint scent of water and silt. A little farther on, you spot another bakery smaller than the first, with a single clay oven in the open air. The baker is older, his hair silver at the temples, and his hands are busy shaping dough into something far less bird-like. Long, flat loaves with pointed ends. He greets you with a nod, his eyes narrowing slightly as he notices the 2 animal loaves you're still holding. Here's your historical fact. Not all bread in ancient Egypt was for display or ceremony. The majority was plain, practical, and made in shapes that stacked easily for storage and transport. These loaves were often used as wages for workers, especially those on large state projects like tomb construction. The old baker takes a lump of dough and begins to work it with slow precision. As he shapes it, he sprinkles the surface with crushed coriander seeds, the smell sharp and refreshing in the warm air. Here's your obscure tidbit. Coriander was a common addition to bread in Egypt, both for flavor and for what people believed were its medicinal properties. Some recipes even mixed it with date syrup for festival breads. Historians still debate whether flavorings like coriander were an everyday luxury or something saved for wealthier customers. What's certain is that the seeds made even a simple loaf smell enticing from several stalls away. You thank the baker for letting you watch, and he gestures toward the river, as if to say, that's where you'll end up sooner or later. You're not sure if he means today or in the grander sense, so you smile politely and step back into the street. The path toward the river winds past houses with open shutters, their interiors shaded and cool. You catch glimpses of everyday life inside. Women grinding grain on flat stones, children chasing each other with woven reed toys, a man sitting cross-legged while repairing a fishing net. The smells change with each doorway: lentil stew here, fresh laundry there, the faint tang of fish drying on racks. Eventually, you reach the riverbank, where a small market has gathered under the palm trees. Fishermen sell their catch straight from their boats, the fish laid out on mats beside baskets of bread. Some of these loaves are round and plain, others molded into fish shapes to match the day's trade. Here's your historical fact. Bread wasn't only eaten on it was often paired with fish, cheese, or vegetables, forming the core of the Egyptian diet for most people. In fishing towns, it was common to find bread, shaped like fish, as a kind of edible advertisement. A young woman behind one of the stalls offers you a loaf, shaped like a tilapia, its scales carefully scored into the dough before baking. She explains between sales that tilapia were considered symbols of regeneration, often linked to the sun god because they appeared to rise from the depths each morning. Here's your obscure tidbit. Tilapia even appear in some tomb art as part of rebirth scenes, swimming alongside lotuses in the waters of creation. Historians still debate whether bread shaped like fish was meant to invoke these deeper meanings for everyday buyers, or if it was just clever marketing. The river glints in the afternoon sun, and you can hear the slap of water against wooden hulls. Somewhere upstream, a larger boat is being loaded with baskets, likely for a temple feast or a wealthy household's gathering. You bite into the fish-shaped loaf, still warm from the oven, and watch the slow, constant movement of life along the Nile. The afternoon heat settles in like an uninvited guest, slow-heavy and unwilling to leave. The marketplace thins as people retreat to shaded courtyards or cool interiors. You find yourself walking along a quieter stretch of riverbank, where only the occasional fisherman or washerwoman breaks the stillness. The water here is calmer, and the reeds sway lazily in the breeze. Up ahead, a cluster of mud-brick buildings sits close to the shore. From one doorway drifts the unmistakable smell of baking bread, warm and earthy even in the open air. A small boy sits outside, his legs dangling from the low wall, carving patterns into a lump of dough with a reed stylus. Here's your historical fact. Some Egyptian breads were decorated before baking, with lines, dots, and stamped images pressed into the dough. These marks could indicate the bakery that made them, the purpose they were for, or simply serve as ornamentation. The boy proudly holds up his work, a crude but charming attempt at shaping the dough into a duck with patterned wings. He places it on a reed mat beside several others, all in various stages of artistic ambition. Here's your obscure tidbit. In some cases, bakers used carved wooden molds to press intricate designs into festival loaves, creating repeating patterns far more precise than hand carving could achieve. Historians still debate whether these molds were a luxury limited to elite households, or if they were more widely available in bustling cities like Thebes. A woman emerges from inside, carrying a tray toward the oven-surrounded clay dome with a wide mouth, glowing faintly from the heat inside. She slides the tray in with a practiced motion, the loaves disappearing into the warm, dry darkness. You watch the boy start on another dough duck, his tongue peeking out in concentration as he shapes the beak. Leaving the riverside, you cut back into the city's winding lanes, where the sun filters in stripes through overhead awnings. The hum of daily life returns, potters working their wheels, weavers clacking looms, merchants calling prices in steady, rhythmic tones. You follow your nose to another bakery, this one tucked into the corner of a courtyard shared by several households. The baker here is kneeling beside a low table, forming a row of loaves shaped like geese. The necks curve upward elegantly, as though the breadbirds are watching you with suspicion. Here's your historical fact. Geese were a common symbol of prosperity in ancient Egypt, appearing in art, literature, and even children's toys. Bread shaped like geese was sometimes given as a gift during festivals or as part of dowry. The baker dips his hands into a bowl of sesame seeds and sprinkles them over each loaf, creating the illusion of speckled feathers. He explains, half in jest, that the sesame keeps the geese from flying away during baking. Here's your obscure tidbit. Sesame was not native to Egypt, but introduced through trade routes, quickly becoming a popular ingredient in breads and sweets alike. Its inclusion in decorative loaves added both texture and a sign of wealth. Historians still debate whether sesame was commonly used in everyday bread or reserved for special occasions, but the careful placement on these loaves suggests they're meant for more than just a casual meal. As you linger, a neighbor leans out of an upper window to watch the process, offering unsolicited advice about the proper curve of a goose's neck in bread form. The baker nods politely, reshapes one loaf ever so slightly, then shoots you a glance that says he's been hearing the same critique for years. The oven is ready, the loaves go in, and the smell of toasting sesame follows you as you wander back into the sunlit lanes. By now, the day has taken on that slow, golden quality where the sunlight feels thick enough to stir with a spoon. You wander toward the heart of the city, where the streets widen into a plaza. Here the noise of the market is replaced by the quieter rustle of official business scribes at shaded tables, guards leaning on spears, and the faint tapping of sandals on stone. On one side of the plaza stands a small temple, its entrance framed by lotus columns painted in bright colors. A narrow table just inside the gate holds offerings, flowers, small jars of beer, and, of course, bread in multiple animal forms. One loaf in particular catches your eye, duck with tiny poppy seeds pressed into its back, as though it has freckles. Here's your historical fact. Poppy seeds were sometimes used in ancient Egypt as a garnish for bread, though they were imported and therefore a rarity. Their presence on a ceremonial loaf was as much about status as it was about flavor. A priest in a linen kilt notices your interest and explains, with quiet pride, that the loaf was baked by one of the temple's own artisans. He says the seeds symbolize fertility and abundance, although you suspect that showing off might also be part of the equation. Here's your obscure tidbit. Temple bakeries often employed their own staff, separate from the city's commercial bakers, to ensure ritual purity and quality. These bakers might work exclusively for religious events, never selling their bread to the public. Historians still debate whether temple bread recipes were meaningfully different from household ones or if the distinction was purely ceremonial. The priest invites you to place your hands over the warm loaf in a symbolic gesture of blessing. You do so, feeling the faint heat of the oven still clinging to it, the seeds rough under your fingertips. When you step back into the plaza, the sound of sandals and scribes returns, the moment sealed like a loaf cooling on a reed mat. The plaza opens into a shaded alley lined with workrooms. You catch the scent of damp clay and ash before you see the source. A potter shaping large jars for grain storage. He greets you with a wave, his hands coated in wet earth, and points to a smaller table where his apprentice is carving bread molds from soft wood. Here's your historical fact. Wooden molds were used to standardize bread shapes and sizes, particularly for large orders or ceremonial loaves that needed uniformity. Designs could be simple, just a round depression, or elaborate, with carved animals, plants, or geometric patterns. The apprentice proudly shows you a mold with a carved duck. Its wings spread slightly as if it's about to lift from the water. He runs his finger along the grooves, explaining how the dough is pressed in, then tapped free before baking. Here's your obscure tidbit. Some molds were family heirlooms, passed down through generations of bakers, their carvings smoothed from years of use, but still producing recognizable shapes. Historians still debate whether these molds were considered personal property of the baker or tools belonging to the household or institution they served. You watch as the apprentice dusts the mold with flour to prevent sticking, then presses a lump of dough inside. He taps it twice, just as his master instructed, and the small duck shape slides free, its details crisp and ready for the oven. The smell of baking drifts from somewhere nearby, reminding you that in this city, there is never more than a short walk between you and the next loaf. As you leave, you glance back at the workroom. The wooden molds lined up neatly on a shelf like an audience of patient, unbaked birds. The late afternoon light turns the city's walls to honey gold as you make your way back toward the river. The streets are quieter now, with most of the morning's bustle replaced by the slower rhythm of evening preparations. Somewhere nearby, a millstone grinds in steady circles, the sound low and soothing, like a giant breathing in its sleep. You pass a small bakery that's clearly a family operation, just two people working side by side. The older man is shaping dough, while the younger, perhaps his daughter, tends the fire. Their specialty seems to be miniature breads, no larger than your palm, each one shaped like a different bird: ducks, geese, herons, even a few sparrows. Here's your historical fact. Miniature breads were often used in offerings or as part of banquet displays, where quantity and variety were as important as size. They could be eaten, but many were purely decorative for the duration of the event. The daughter dusts a finished loaf with fine ground barley flour, so it has a pale, velvety sheen. She explains that the lighter color is considered more elegant for feasts, though it does make the bread look suspiciously like it's wearing makeup. Here's your obscure tidbit. Some feasts in wealthier households featured bread sculptures as table centerpieces, sometimes arranged in little scenes, like a flock of geese walking across a table toward a larger loaf, shaped like a barn. Historians still debate whether guests were expected to eat these arrangements, or if they were simply admired until they went stale. The old man offers you a tiny sparrow loaf, still warm. It's almost too small to bite, but you do anyway. It's airy inside, with just a hint of honey. You thank them, slipping the rest into your pouch before heading on toward the river's glow. The sun is low when you reach the riverbank again, the light stretching into long liquid reflections on the water. Boats are tied up along the shore, their crews unloading baskets and clay jars. Among them is a delivery clearly bound for a feaster's stack of reed trays piled with bread in every imaginable animal form. Here's your historical fact. Bread deliveries for elite households were often made by boat, particularly in cities along the Nile. It was faster and easier to transport large quantities of fragile loaves over water than through the crowded streets. A delivery boy sets down his tray for a moment to rest, and you see the loaves up close: ducks with perfectly defined feathers, fish with delicately scored fins, and even a few hippopotamus-shaped breads whose round bellies make them look permanently cheerful. Here's your obscure tidbit. In some cases, hippo-shaped breads were made for protective purposes, invoking the fierce motherly nature of the goddess Tauret, who is often depicted as a hippopotamus. Historians still debate whether these protective breads were eaten after the event, or kept for a time, perhaps drying into hard talismans. The boy wipes his brow, then calls to the boatman to help reload the trays for the final stretch of the delivery. You watch them push off, the boat gliding smoothly into the current, the bread animals lined up as if taking a slow, ceremonial ride down the Nile. As the ripples fade behind the boat, you feel the evening settle around you, slower, softer, and scented faintly with yeast and river air. Somewhere ahead, lamps are being lit, their reflections dancing like golden crumbs scattered across the water. The first stars are just beginning to flicker above the rooftops as you wander back into the city. The air has cooled enough that people have stepped outside again, neighbors talking over low walls, children chasing each other through the alleys, the sound of a distant flute winding its way between buildings. You pass a courtyard where a group of women are gathered around a long table, their hands busy with dough. Instead of the animals you've seen all day, these loaves are shaped like folded lotus flowers. The petals are carefully scored into the surface, each loaf a small, edible bloom. Here's your historical fact. Lotus flowers were powerful symbols in Egyptian culture, representing rebirth, the sun, and purity. Bread shaped like lotuses sometimes appeared in temple offerings, particularly in rituals linked to the sun god Ra. One of the women sprinkles crushed dates into the center of a lotus loaf, before folding the petals back into place. She tells you this makes the bread open with sweetness when broken apart. It's hard not to imagine this going over well at any dinner table, ancient or modern. Here's your obscure tidbit. Sweet fillings in bread were more common than most people think, with combinations like dates and honey or figs and sesame enjoyed on special occasions. Historians still debate whether sweetened ceremonial breads were eaten only by priests or if they were shared with the wider community after the ritual. The women laugh as one loaf collapses into something more like a potato than a lotus, but it's quickly reshaped and tucked among the others. The smell of dates and baking flour follows you as you continue your walk, the streets now glowing with lamplight. Night settles fully, and the city takes on a softer tone. The shouts of merchants are gone, replaced by the occasional clink of pottery, the murmur of quiet conversation, and the steady chirp of crickets. You find yourself near a small riverside shrine. An elderly man in a white linen robe is placing offerings on a flat stone small fish, a jar of beer, and of course, a single loaf of bread shaped like a duck. Its surface gleams faintly in the lamplight, as though brushed with oil. Here's your historical fact. Oil glazing was sometimes used on bread intended for offerings, both to enhance its appearance and to keep it from drying out too quickly before the ritual was complete. The man hums softly as he works, adjusting the loaf so the duck's beak points toward the water. He explains that the bread is for his late wife, who loved ducks and would laugh at the idea of one swimming into the afterlife. Here's your obscure tidbit. Some personal offerings were not part of official temple practice, but made privately, combining religious symbolism with individual sentiment. Historians still debate how much personal customization was allowed within the formal structure of Egyptian religious life. The man finishes his quiet prayer, dips his fingers into the river, and sprinkles a few drops over the bread. He gives you a gentle nod before stepping back into the shadows, leaving the offering to stand alone under the stars. The river glimmers beside you, the current carrying the scent of silt, fish, and the lingering warmth of the day. It's a fitting calm before the final stretch of your journey. You wander along the riverbank one last time, the path now lit only by the glow of oil lamps in doorways and the silver shimmer of moonlight on water. The day's heat has fully faded, replaced by the cool breath of night. Somewhere behind you, the city still murmurs, pots being stacked away, shutters drawn, a low laugh drifting from an unseen courtyard. But here, by the water, the sound is softer, the pace slower. A final bakery catches your eye, its oven still glowing faintly as the last loaves are pulled free. These are not ducks or geese or fish, just simple, round loaves, plain and unadorned. The baker explains that these are for the night watchmen, who will carry them through the long hours until morning. Here's your historical fact. Night workers in Egyptian cities often received bread as part of their payment, ensuring they had something to eat while patrolling or keeping watch. One loaf has been pressed with the faint outline of a reed boat, barely visible in the firelight. The baker shrugs. It's not for ceremony, just a quiet nod to the Nile they depend on. Here's your obscure tidbit. Even plain bread could bear small, personal touches, patterns pressed in with a thumb. A single seed set in the center marks that meant something only to the person who made it. Historians still debate whether these personal markings were considered a signature of pride, or simply a way to pass time during the repetition of daily work. The baker offers you one of the warm loaves, and you take it, the crust crackling softly in your hands. It smells faintly of barley and smoke, a humble ending to a day filled with elaborate shapes and symbols. You stand for a while by the river, the moon reflected in the slow-moving water, and take a bite. It's not as sweet as the duck loaves, or as delicate as the lotus, but it is steady, filling, and real. The day begins not with sunlight, but with the quiet drip of melted frost from the cloister roof. Somewhere in the abbey, a bell tolls, a low, round sound that rolls through the corridors like a lazy wave. The air smells faintly of damp parchment and beeswax polish, with a hint of last night's wood smoke still lingering near the walls. You're in England, in the late 14th century, and the world outside is brisk, grey, and muddied with the business of winter. Inside, it is calmer, quieter, possibly boring. You probably won't make it through this day, but that's all right. Most of the books here are designed to outlast you anyway. Before we wander any further, I'll gently remind you, if you enjoy being guided through the utterly uneventful dramas of history's most patient people, please like and subscribe. It costs nothing, unlike the replacement of a stolen manuscript, and it lets me keep wandering through centuries without having to pawn my inkpot. And if you're awake enough, comment where you're listening from and what time it is. I'll imagine it, nod politely, and get back to describing the smell of old vellum. Now, let's ease into tonight's journey. You follow a narrow passageway that opens into the scriptorium, the library's working heart. The room is long and high, with windows too small to admit much warmth, but just enough light to work by. The benches are lined with books, not stacked loosely, but each one tethered to the desk by a chain. The chains are not crude, they are carefully forged, with swivel links that prevent tangling, allowing the book to be opened and read, but not carried far. Here's your historical fact. Many medieval libraries kept their most valuable manuscripts chained to shelves or desks to prevent theft. This wasn't paranoia, it was practical. A single illuminated manuscript could take years to produce, costing as much as a modest house. At the far end of the room, you notice a small, ginger shape curled on a folded robe. The abbey's cat, named, of course, because naming implies attachmentees, fast asleep, tail flicking lazily. Its presence here is no accident. Here's your obscure tidbit. Cats were sometimes kept deliberately in medieval libraries, not as pets, but as working members of the space to catch mice that would otherwise nibble parchment, bindings, or precious stored grain. Historians still debate whether these cats were officially owned by the monastery or simply tolerated in exchange for their pest control services. A monk passes you carrying a manuscript with a chain trailing from it like a lazy snake, setting it down gently on a lectern. He glances at the cat, then at you, as if to say, both are necessary, and both can be temperamental if disturbed. The morning light brightens slightly, turning the frost on the windows into little rivulets. Somewhere outside, boots squelch through muddy courtyard paths as another monk brings in kindling for the warming braziers. The scriptorium is awake, now quills scratching faintly, chains clinking, pages turning with the soft rustle of skin-thin parchment. You stop by a desk where a particularly ornate manuscript is chained. The chain is attached to the upper corner of the binding, where it will interfere least with reading. The brass fitting is shaped into a tiny catafleuler flourish that suggests whoever commissioned it had opinions about even the smallest details. Here's your historical fact. Chains in medieval libraries were often fixed to the forage of the book, the side opposite the spine, so the book could be stored inward, making the pages accessible without having to move it far. On the floor nearby, The cat has relocated now, stretched luxuriously on its side beneath the desk, one paw batting lazily at the end of a dangling chain. You get the sense this is a breach of protocol, though no one seems willing to correct it. Here's your obscure tidbit. Some surviving medieval manuscripts still have paw prints on their pages, ink smudges or dusty impressions left by cats wandering across open books. Historians still debate whether these paw prints were accidents or tolerated signatures of the animal staff. A monk seated at the desk looks up briefly, then leans closer to whisper, "Better a paw print than teeth marks." His eyes slide toward a small wooden box on the shelf, where the spine of a volume is clearly chewed at one corner, evidence, perhaps, of a mouse that made it past the feline defenses. You wander further along the room, the soft chime of moving chains following you, like the quiet percussion of a place that has accepted slowness as a permanent state of being. The cat follows you halfway, then collapses mid-dial, as though reminding you that here, not even the guardians are in a hurry. By mid-morning, the scriptorium air has warmed enough that you can smell the faint tang of iron gall ink. It's a sharp, almost metallic scent, softened by the musk of vellum and the dust that never quite leaves the corners of the room. You find yourself at a bench where a monk is carefully copying the Gospel of John. His quill moves slowly, dipping into a tiny horn inkpot every few words. The rhythm hypnotic: scratch, pause, dip, scratch. The book he works on is, of course, chained. The chain loops down from the desk's edge to a metal bar running along the floor, secured with a simple lock. It's not much to look at, but the monk tells you it has done its job for more than 40 years. "We've only lost one book in my lifetime," he says, "and that was to fire, not theft." Here's your historical fact. Chained libraries were common in parts of Europe well into the 18th century. Even when printed books became more affordable, certain rare works remained literally locked in place. You glance over at the cat, who is stationed herself by the wall where a faint scratching sound betrays a rodent's hiding place. She's poised still as a gargoyle, tail tip flicking once every few seconds. You get the sense this is her true workplace. Everything else is just lounging between assignments. Here's your obscure tidbit. Medieval accounts occasionally mention cats being fed not from the abbey stores but from the spoils of their own hunting: mice, voles, and the occasional unlucky sparrow. Historians still debate whether this was thrift or simply a practical way of ensuring cats stayed motivated. The monk leans back, flexing his cramped fingers. He dips a cloth in a shallow bowl of water and dabs at a smudge in the margin, muttering under his breath about careless elbows. His eyes flick to you. "Even chained books need guarding," he says, "and not just from thieves." Outside, the sound of the abbey bell drifts in, marking midday. The scriptorium thins out as some monks head to the refectory for the main meal of the day. A few stay behind, perhaps preferring the quiet to the bustle of communal eating. You decide to linger, enjoying the way the absence of footsteps makes the chain clinks more noticeably like wind chimes in a still room. You wander toward the back of the library, where older manuscripts sit under heavier dust. The chains here are thicker, the locks more elaborate, as if the books might attempt escape on their own. One is a legal codex bound in dark, cracked leather, its four-edged clasp worn to a dull shine from centuries of careful turning. Here's your historical fact. In some libraries, the most precious or politically sensitive works, legal records, royal charters, theological treatises, were given thicker chains and stored farthest from the door. A soft thump draws your attention. The cat has leaped onto a low shelf, tail curling round her paws as she surveys her domain. She blinks slowly at you, then turns to examine a cobweb in the corner with a seriousness usually reserved for theological debate. Here's your obscure tidbit. Certain monastic records note payments for cat bedding in library inventories, suggesting that some abbey cats were given official, designated sleeping spots. Historians still debate whether these records indicate genuine fondness or simply another form of pest control investment. As you turn to leave, you notice something on a nearby desk: a half-finished illumination in gold leaf. The artist has painted a small, almost hidden figure in the corner, a curled-up cat, sleeping beneath the margin vines. You can't tell whether it's a tribute to the current guardian or a whimsical nod to all those who have padded silently through these aisles before. The light shifts through the high windows, making the gold shimmer faintly. Somewhere outside, the bell tolls again, but in here, time feels caught anchored as firmly as the books themselves. After the midday meal, The scriptorium fills again slowly, as if the monks have to convince themselves to leave the warmth of the refectory hearth. You can smell bread lingering on their robes, the yeasty sweetness mingling with the scent of parchment. The cat is back at her post by the narrow south window, where the light falls in a pale stripe across the desk. She yawns widely, revealing small needle-like teeth, the same ones that have almost certainly punctured a book corner or two. You pause near a lectern where a heavy, chained volume sits open. Its pages are covered in dense Latin text, with a wide margin where a small hand has scrawled something in Middle English. A note to the next reader about a particularly confusing passage. Marginalia, it seems, has always been part commentary, part conversation. Here's your historical fact. Chained libraries often organized books by subject, with chains affixed to long horizontal rods running through each desk or shelf, allowing readers to find and consult books without ever removing them from their stations. At the far end of the room, a young scribe mutters under his breath. He's bent over a page where an inky pawprint mars the otherwise immaculate script. You watch him gently scrape at it with a tiny knife, muttering something about feline blasphemy. Here's your obscure tidbit. One 15th century manuscript from Dubrovnik still bears a note from its scribe, apologizing for the smudges, explaining that a cat spilled ink across the page. Historians still debate whether the note was meant in earnest or with a touch of dry humor. Monks were capable of both. The scribe catches you watching, shrugs, and smiles faintly. Better this than rats, he says. The cat, oblivious to the incident she has likely caused, begins to wash her paw in the sunlight. The day edges toward afternoon, the light becoming more golden through the narrow windows. The long shadows make the chains glint, each one catching the sun for a brief moment, as it sways from a reader's movement. The air feels slower now. Even the quills scratch less urgently. You notice a monk in a corner, gently oiling the hinges of a lock on one of the older chains. The iron has worn smooth from centuries of touch, but the mechanism still works its teeth, catching with a satisfying click. Here's your historical fact. The chains in medieval libraries were typically made of wrought iron and designed to allow the book to be read in place, but never far from its anchor point, an elegant balance between access and protection. The cat, meanwhile, has relocated to a stack of wooden boards, the kind used for binding books. She kneads at one absent-mindedly, leaving faint claw marks. The monk working nearby doesn't shoo her away, perhaps considering her work an unofficial inspection of the materials. Here's your obscure tidbit. Some library cats were given collars with small bells, not to track them, but to warn rodents that a hunter was near. Apparently, the psychological effect on pests was thought to be worth it. Historians still debate whether this was actually effective pest control or more of a symbolic gesture, like a decorative guard on a door that rarely locked. You pass the same legal codex you saw earlier, still open to the same page. A scrap of vellum marks the spot, and you can't help but think that in this place, time moves at the pace of ink drying. The only real urgency comes from the occasional scurry in the rafters, and the cat, now fully awake, is listening. By late afternoon, the light through the high windows has taken on a kind of honeyed glow, thick and slow, as if it would rather not move toward evening. The chains cast long narrow shadows across the desks, patterning the floor in looping iron shapes. Somewhere near the back, you hear the faint click of a key turning, someone unlocking a particularly precious manuscript for a visiting scholar. You wander closer. The book is a psalter, its pages edged in gold, the illuminations still rich and vivid despite the centuries. The chain attached to its binding is heavier than most, its links thicker, the metal darker from age. It's not hard to imagine the weight as both literal and symbolic, a reminder that knowledge here is to be approached with reverence, not carted off under your cloak. Here's your historical fact. Some monastic libraries had strict borrowing rules, not just that the books couldn't leave the room, but that certain volumes could only be handled in the presence of a librarian or senior monk. The cat, meanwhile, has followed you and now sits beneath the psalter's desk, tail curling around her feet, eyes half-lidded but alert. The scholar above, draped in a thick wool cloak, reaches down to scratch behind her ears without looking away from the page. You suspect this is a ritual as old as the chain on the book itself. Here's your obscure tidbit. A few surviving medieval library inventories list cat food as a regular expense alongside ink, quills, and parchment, suggesting an official budget line for their upkeep. Historians still debate whether this meant the cats were truly employed by the monastery or simply tolerated residents with a well-developed talent for lingering where warmth and attention could be found. The scholar hums softly as he reads, the cat purrs, and the chain between book and desk sways almost imperceptibly. 3 different rhythms in the same quiet chord. The hour grows later, and the scriptorium begins to thin out again. A few monks drift toward vespers, their sandals whispering against the flagstones. You stay, watching as the librarian makes his slow circuit, checking chains, closing clasps, and gently straightening the books on their desks. He pauses at a desk where a small herbal manuscript sits open, its illustrations of plants delicate but surprisingly colorful. The chain attached to it has a different patina than the others, more bronze than iron, hinting that it may have been repaired, or even replaced, over the years. Here's your historical fact. Not all chained libraries use the same metal for their fittings. Some incorporated brass or bronze elements, which were less prone to rust in damp conditions. The cat takes this moment to leap onto a low shelf, investigating the herbal with a slow sniff. She rubs her cheek against the corner of the desk, as though claiming it. The librarian doesn't stop her, only murmurs something under his breath that might be approval. Here's your obscure tidbit. In certain monastic traditions, cats were thought to be blessed creatures, their vigilance against vermin seen as an extension of the monastery's work to protect its treasures. Historians still debate whether this belief was widespread or simply the personal sentiment of a few cat-loving scribes who happened to write it down. You glance back toward the door, where the last of the daylight spills in from the cloister. The chains glint in the dimming light, each one a slender line connecting centuries of hands, eyes, and quiet devotion. The cat settles in for the evening, tucking her paws under her chest, a silent sentinel among the books, unchained herself, yet bound to this place by something older than locks. Night's approach changes the room's rhythm. The light no longer pours through the windows but drips, slow and dim, pooling on the desks closest to the glass. Candles are brought in, thick pale pillars of tallow that smell faintly of smoke and something sweet, perhaps honey. Their light is soft and unsteady, turning the gold in illuminated pages into tiny flickers, as if the saints themselves were breathing. The librarian moves with deliberate care now, lighting each candle and checking that no flame sits too close to parchment. Fire is the sworn enemy of this place, more feared than thieves, mice, or even damp. The chains, for all their rattling, would do little to stop it. Here's your historical fact. Medieval libraries often had strict rules about lighting, with candles only allowed in certain areas or under constant supervision to prevent devastating fires. The cat has taken up residence near one of the warmer candlelit desks, stretching out to absorb the glow as if she, too, is on guard duty. She blinks at you slowly, which in her language probably means, you may approach the queen now. Here's your obscure tidbit. In some illuminated manuscripts, small cat figures can be found in the margins, often curled up near a depiction of a fireplace or candle, playful nod from the artist, perhaps to the real cats warming themselves nearby as the work was done. Historians still debate whether these little feline cameos were mere decoration or sly portraits of specific cats beloved by the scribes. Outside, the bells toll Compline, the final service of the day. A few monks drift in to return the books they've been using, sliding them back into place and securing their chains with practiced hands. The soft chink of metal follows each one, a quiet punctuation mark at the end of a sentence. With Compline over the abbey's main corridors grow still. In the scriptorium, the librarian works his final round, closing clasps, extinguishing candles one by one, and locking the heavy oak door that leads to the rarest collection. The sudden absence of flame leaves only moonlight filtering through the high windows, silvering the chains and making them look, for a moment, like thin streams of water frozen mid-fall. Here's your historical fact. Some chained libraries were open to outsiders, traveling scholars, visiting clergy, or wealthy patrons, but only during daylight, and often under the constant supervision of a librarian who doubled as a guard. The cat follows him as he moves through the room, tail high, clearly aware that she is exempt from all closing time rules. She stops at a small wooden stool near the wall, curls into a tight ball, and begins her evening grooming ritual with the thoroughness of one who takes her duties seriously. Here's your obscure tidbit. Monastic records occasionally note the burial of a library cat within the abbey grounds. sometimes with a small stone marker an honor rarely extended to other working animals. Historians still debate whether this reflected genuine affection or symbolic acknowledgement of the cat's role in protecting sacred texts. The librarian pauses beside her, murmuring something you can't quite hear. Perhaps it's a prayer, perhaps a joke, perhaps a simple good night. Then he steps out, leaving you and the cat alone in the soft silence. The only sounds now are the faint settling of the building and the distant drip of water in the cloister garden. The chains do not move, yet their presence hums faintly in the air links, connecting not just books to desks, but generations to the knowledge they have guarded, night after night, century after century. The hours after Compline belong to the shadows. Moonlight angles in through the narrow windows, painting the chained books in silver and deep blue. The scriptorium is still, but not lifeless. Wood creaks softly as it exhales the day's warmth, and somewhere high in the rafters, a small rustle hints at a mouse who has made a poor life choice tonight. The cat lifts her head. She doesn't pounce right away. Instead, she watches the dark corner with the slow certainty of one who understands that patience is deadlier than speed. Her tail tip twitches once, twice, then stills. You wonder how many such quiet battles have played out here, unrecorded but essential. Here's your historical fact. Medieval monasteries often kept detailed records of everything from ink usage to grain storage, but the work of cats went mostly unnoticed. Their role in preserving manuscripts was arguably as critical as that of the scribes themselves. The moonlight shifts, catching the edge of an illuminated page left open on a desk. The image of vine curling around a saint's portrait gleams faintly. Just beside it, pressed into the parchment, is what looks suspiciously like the faint impression of a paw. Here's your obscure tidbit. One 15th century manuscript in the National Library of the Netherlands bears a perfect set of muddy cat paw prints across its pages, immortalizing a feline intrusion from over 500 years ago. Historians still debate whether the scribe cursed the cat in that moment, or simply sighed and kept working. The rustle in the rafters grows louder. The cat moves, silent as the chain shadows across the floor. You don't see the moment of capture, only the return. Tail high, eyes bright. Another night's work done in service to knowledge. Near midnight, the scriptorium settles again. The air has cooled, and the faint smell of extinguished candles lingers like a memory. You sit at one of the desks, running your fingers lightly along the iron links of a nearby chain. They are cold, but not unfriendly, solid, in a way that promises the book they guard will still be here tomorrow, and the next day, and long after you've gone. Here's your historical fact. The practice of chaining books began in the early Middle Ages and persisted in some places until the 18th century, when printed works became widespread enough to make theft less of a threat. From the corner, the cat pads over and hops onto the desk. She walks the length of the open manuscript, as though inspecting your posture, then curls up directly on the blank margin of the page. You suspect that if you were a scribe, she'd be precisely where your hand needed to be. Here's your obscure tidbit. Marginal doodles of cats can sometimes be found in medieval manuscripts, drawn by bored scribes, or as subtle commentary on their real-life companions' habits. Historians still debate whether these drawings were affectionate portraits or sly jabs at cats. Well-known tendency to sit directly on top of important work. The moonlight glints on the clasp of the chained book, making it momentarily resemble a tiny star. The cat's breathing slows, her ears flick once, and the building sighs around you. In the hush of midnight, with the knowledge of centuries anchored all around you, you begin to feel the strange, steady comfort of a place where nothing is in a hurry, not even time. Ask Chachi. The small hours have their own kind of stillness, the sort that feels older than the building itself. The moon has shifted west, leaving most of the scriptorium in shadow, with just a pale beam resting on one particular desk. There, a chained volume sits half open, its vellum pages curved like the wings of a sleeping bird. The cat stirs and leaps down from her post, landing without a sound. She walks the length of the room, nose to the floor, tracing invisible paths only she understands. At one point she stops, ears swiveling, then resumes her patrol with the quiet dignity of a night watchman who also happens to enjoy sunbeams when they're available. Here's your historical fact. In some large medieval libraries, books were chained in such a way that multiple volumes could share a single rod. Their chains spaced so they could be read side by side for study and comparison. The air is cooler now, and with it comes the faint scent of the cloister garden, a mix of damp stone, crushed mint, and the last trace of candle smoke. You glance at the cat, who pauses beside the lectern holding a great Bible. Its chain thick and its clasp as ornate as a reliquary. Here's your obscure tidbit. Some chains were not fixed directly to the book, but to a metal fitting riveted into its wooden boards, often decorated with stamped designs or the owner's emblem. Historians still debate whether these decorative fittings were meant to display pride in the book's value or simply reflected the medieval tendency to embellish anything that could be embellished. The cat hops onto the Bible's stand, curls into the curve of the book's spine, and closes her eyes. You imagine that for her, the distinction between holy text and ordinary ledger is irrelevant. Both make for an equally comfortable bed. Dawn is still hours away, but there's a sense subtle yet certain that the night is beginning to loosen its hold. The darkness in the scriptorium feels less dense, as if the room is quietly anticipating the first sound of sandals in the corridor. The cat is awake again, washing her paws with meticulous care. She pauses mid-lick to glance at the door, ears pricked, though there's no sound yet. Perhaps she knows before you do that the day will soon begin its slow return. Here's your historical fact. Some chained libraries were arranged with desks facing outward toward the walls, so readers could work in relative quiet, while others faced inward in long rows, creating a shared rhythm of page-turning and You trace a finger over the cold iron of one chain, noting how the links are worn smooth in the middle but still sharp at the edges, a silent record of countless hands pulling it forward, then letting it fall back. Here's your obscure tidbit. In rare cases, chains were plated with a thin layer of tin or pewter, not for strength, but to make them look uniform and polished, especially in libraries attached to wealthy institutions. Historians still debate whether this was purely aesthetic, or if the coating helped protect the metal from corrosion in damp climates. The cat jumps down from her perch, crosses the floor in 3 quick strides, and disappears into the hallway off to greet the first stirrings of morning before anyone else arrives. The scriptorium remains in shadow, but it holds the faint promise of light, waiting to spill in and touch each chain, each clasp, and each page in turn, as it has for centuries. The first pale thread of morning creeps across the floor, slipping through the high windows and catching on the links of the nearest chain. The scriptorium exhales a soundless loosening after a long night of stillness. Somewhere outside, the low murmur of voices begins, monks exchanging quiet greetings in the cloister. The cat is already back, materializing in the doorway as though she's always been there. She pads across the flagstones with the confidence of someone who knows every squeak in the floor. In the new light, you notice a faint dusting of cobweb clinging to her whiskers. Clearly, she has been on important business. Here's your historical fact. By the late Middle Ages, the practice of chaining books began to decline in some regions, replaced by locked cabinets or entirely new library layouts, though in a few places, the chains would remain for hundreds of years more. She hops onto a desk near the window, the one with the heavy psalter you saw days ago, was it only yesterday, and curls up in the warm square of sun. The chain of the psalter rests against her flank, gleaming faintly in the light. Here's your obscure tidbit. There is a 17th century record from Hereford Cathedral noting that their library cat did sleep upon the chain of the Great Bible and was not disturbed. Historians still debate whether this was recorded with irritation or affection. You sit for a while longer, letting the sunlight creep across your hands, the same way it has across these desks for centuries. The chains do not feel restrictive now. They feel like threads in a great tapestry, holding the books, the building, the people and, yes, even the cats together in one long, continuous story. The dawn in the Andes comes slowly, as if the sun itself is taking a moment to stretch before it climbs over the mountains. The first light is thin and gold, washing over the stone paths like a spilled ribbon of honey. You're standing at the edge of a high ridge, the air sharp enough to wake you fully, though honestly, you probably won't make it through this day. That's fine. Most people, faced with this much uphill running, wouldn't. Before we go any further, let me gently remind you, if a quiet walk or an exhausting sprint through the history of the Inca messengers is your sort of evening, you can like and subscribe for more long, slow histories. It's free, and it lets me keep making these without having to run barefoot across the Andes myself. And, if you're still awake enough, leave a comment telling me your location and what time it is where you are. I'll imagine you listening, maybe in bed, maybe on a train, and I'll nod politely, just like the Inca would when passing along news. Now, Let's ease into tonight's journey. You begin on the Capac One, the vast road system of the Inca Empire. This isn't some dusty footpath, it's a network of stone-paved highways stretching more than 25,000 miles through mountains, valleys, and coastlines. The kind of road system that would make a Roman raise an eyebrow in respect. Here's your historical fact. The Inca used a relay system of messengers called chasqui, trained runners who could cover up to 150 miles in a single day by working in shifts. No horses, no wheels, just lungs, legs, and the occasional helpful breeze. You hear the faint patter of bare feet on stone. Around the bend comes a young chasqui, small and lean, a woven headband holding back wind-tangled hair. In his hand, he carries a kipua knotted string, record holding the empire's secrets in loops of colored thread. He doesn't slow down to greet you. After all, the message won't deliver itself, and besides, slowing down here is like stopping mid-jog on a treadmill. You might regret starting again. Here's your obscure tidbit. Chasqui often chewed coca leaves to stave off fatigue and altitude sickness, a habit still common in parts of the Andes today. Historians still debate whether chasqui ran truly barefoot or in light sandals of llama leather weight. You can't help but wonder if they ever longed for a pair of thick wool socks. The sound of his footsteps fades into the mountains, leaving you alone with the thin, bright air and the knowledge that somewhere ahead, another runner is already waiting to take the next leg. You follow the path, which clings to the side of the mountain like a careful seam in a vast quilt. The stones beneath your feet are cool in the morning shade, worn smooth by centuries of travelers, messengers, traders, armies, and the occasional lost llama. The air is so clear you can see far into the valley below, where terraced fields curve like green steps toward a silver ribbon of river. Somewhere down there, potatoes are being dug, quinoa is ripening, and no one seems to be in a hurry except, of course, the chasqui. Here's your historical fact. Chasqui relay stations, called tambos, were placed about every 4 to 6 miles along the road. Inside, runners could rest, eat, and hand off their messages to the next in line. These stations also stored supplies for the army and served as administrative checkpoints. You come upon one now, perched on a small plateau with a view in every direction. It's a low stone building with a thatched roof, simple but solid. The door is open, and inside you see a small fire pit, a stack of woven baskets, and 2 runners, one stretching his legs, the other reclining with his head on a bundle of wool blankets. They glance up at you with the kind of polite curiosity you give someone who's clearly not from around here. Here's your obscure tidbit. Messengers didn't just carry verbal or knotted string messages. They sometimes transported small, delicate items like fresh fish from the coast to the highlands, delivered still cold thanks to the speed of the relay. Historians still debate whether the fish was more prized for its taste or for the sheer novelty of eating something from hundreds of miles away. One of the resting runners stands, takes a sip of chitaya, fermented corn, drink hand, steps outside to wait for the next message. You realize that in this system, no one ever truly runs alone. The path stretches on, winding into the high passes, each stone echoing with the footsteps of messengers long gone, still carrying the empire's words through the thin mountain air. The road tilts upward again, a slow and steady climb that makes you wonder if the Inca ever heard of something called switchbacks. The stones here are narrower, the edges crisp where they've been set deep into the mountain slope. Every few paces, a gust of wind brings the smell of cold earth and high grass, mixed with something sharper, burning wood from a cooking fire, far off but carried up the valley like a quiet invitation. You hear footsteps before you see the runner. He appears suddenly over the ridge, not so much running as floating, his stride long and loose, his breath steady. He wears a small pouch slung across his chest, likely carrying coca leaves, a few knots of quipu, and maybe a charm or 2 for luck. He nods to you as he says, quick, efficient, like someone whose calendar is fully booked in miles. Here's your historical fact. The chasqui system was so well organized that messages could travel from the coast to the capital at Cusco over 1,200 miles in less than a week. In modern terms, that's like sending a text and having it arrive slightly before you finished typing it. At your side, the path opens to a ledge overlooking the valley. You spot tiny figures moving between terraces, their woven tunics bright as scraps of sunlight against the green. Somewhere down there is the next tambo, its smoke curling upward to signal warmth, food, and the next link in the chain. Here's your obscure tidbit. Some runners carried a conch shell trumpet, blowing it as they approached a tambo to alert the next chosky to get ready. The call would echo down the mountain, part announcement, part alarm clock. Historians still debate whether these trumpet calls followed a set pattern like an Inca version of Morse code, or if it was more of a freeform "I'm almost there, get moving" kind of signal. The wind shifts, and you hear one of those conch blasts faintly from further down the path. Somewhere ahead, a runner is standing, poised to take off the moment the next message arrives. The trail narrows, hugging the cliffside so closely that you can see the sheer drop to the river below. Elegant reminder to watch your step. The sun is higher now, warming the stone beneath your feet, though the air stays cool and sharp. You pass a cluster of low shrubs covered in tiny red berries, the kind that grow only at this altitude. A pair of hummingbirds darts between them, each movement quicker than a chosky sprint. As you round a bend, you see a runner ahead, standing outside a tambo built into the mountain itself. Its doorway is just high enough to duck into, its walls fitted so tightly that you can't slide a blade of grass between the stones. Inside, you find a clay pot simmering over a small fire, filling the room with the scent of herbs and roasted maize. Here's your historical fact. The Inca road network wasn't just about speed, it was a strategic tool of empire, allowing armies, officials, and goods to move with precision. The chasqui messengers were essentially the empire's circulatory system, keeping information flowing to every distant province. A runner sitting by the fire gestures to a shallow bowl on the table chunks of dried meat, known as charqui, the ancestor of modern jerky. He offers it with a nod, and you take a piece, its smoky saltiness pulling you back to the present. Here's your obscure tidbit. Chasqui were sometimes exempt from certain forms of tax or labor obligations, their running considered a service so vital that it replaced other duties. Historians still debate whether this made the position a highly sought-after honor or a grueling assignment to be avoided if possible, depending, perhaps, on how much you liked running uphill at dawn. Outside, the air is thinner, and the road stretches on toward the next ridge. Somewhere past that rise lies another tambo, another pair of bare feet pounding the stone, and another moment when the message changes hands without a word, just the steady rhythm of breath and the endless sweep of the mountains. You leave the shelter of the tambo, the warmth of the fire fading from your skin as the wind takes its place. The road here is carved straight into the mountainside, a narrow ribbon of stone that seems to float above the valleys. Far below, the river curls like a length of silver thread, catching glints of sunlight between shadows. A new sound reaches you, low and rhythmic. It's not footsteps this time, but the dull thunk-thunk of a runner's staff hitting stone. You spot him in the distance, coming toward you with the easy, loping gait of someone who has done this every day of his life. He wears his hair tied back with a band of woven alpaca wool, the ends trailing like small pennants. Here's your historical fact. Some chasqui carried a short baton as a symbol of authority, especially when transporting messages for the Sapa Inca himself. The baton could serve both as proof of their role and, if necessary, a walking stick for the more treacherous climbs. The runner pauses briefly at your side, exchanging a greeting in Quechua, so short and efficient it might as well be the Andean equivalent of yep. Then he's gone again, already shrinking into the distance, his figure absorbed by the curves of the road. Here's your obscure tidbit. Chasqui were trained from boyhood, often selected for their speed, endurance, and knowledge of the terrain. In some villages, local elders would host informal races to spot promising young runners. Historians still debate whether these selections were purely merit-based or occasionally influenced by family ties, because even in the Andes, a bit of favoritism seems hard to avoid. A cloud passes over the sun, dimming the light, and for a moment you see the road, as the messengers must have, endless, demanding, and yet somehow comforting in its familiarity. Every step is a link in a chain, tying distant lands to the empire's heart. The path widens as it approaches another tambo, this one built at the crest of a high pass. The air here tastes different, cleaner, sharper, and almost weightless, as if the sky itself has thinned. You pass under a low stone arch into the courtyard, where two runners are resting, their sandals off, toes spread out in the cold sunlight. A clay jar stands nearby, filled with chicha morada, a sweet drink made from purple maize. One runner offers you a small gourd of it, and you sip the flavor somewhere between berries and warm spice. Here's your historical fact. The Inca road system included rope suspension bridges that spanned deep gorges, woven entirely from plant fibers. Messengers used these regularly, even at heights that could make your stomach shift just thinking about them. The resting runner chuckles at the memory of one such bridge in the rainy season, swaying so much that a Chosky dropped his quipu halfway across. The message was rescued, but only after a volunteer climbed down the gorge feet, probably worthy of its own ballad. Here's your obscure tidbit. Some tambos were strategically located near natural springs or underground water channels, ensuring that even the highest passes had a reliable water supply for travelers. Historians still debate whether the placement of these tambos was primarily for the comfort of the runners or as a way to mark territory with visible signs of Inca presence. From the pass, the world feels vast. Mountains ripple outward in every direction, their ridges layered like folded cloth. Somewhere down the other side, another runner is waiting, eyes fixed on the horizon for the faint shape of a figure approaching. Breath steady, sandals ready to lift from stone into the wind. The descent from the high pass begins gently, then steepens, each turn revealing another sweep of valleys and terraces. The stones underfoot are slick with a fine layer of frost in the shaded stretches, crunching softly when you step. You imagine a Chosky flying down this slope, every muscle trained to keep speed without tumbling into the potato fields below. Halfway down, you catch sight of something unusual. A Chasky perched on a rock, tying a small bundle into his woven carrying cloth. He notices you, gives a brief nod, and continues his work. Inside the bundle, you glimpse a flash of silver small, fresh fish, still glistening. Here's your historical fact. The Chosky system could transport perishable goods over incredible distances. Fish from the coast could reach Cusco, high in the Andes, in less than 2 days, still cool from their journey. The runner sets off again, bare feet, slapping the stones in a rhythm that matches the sway of his bundle. Here's your obscure tidbit. Chasky were sometimes tasked with delivering not just royal messages, but ceremonial item shells, rare feathers, or even small idols to ensure they arrived in perfect condition for festivals. Historians still debate whether the honor of carrying these sacred objects made the journey feel lighter, or if the responsibility only added to the weight on their backs. The path flattens out at last, and you find yourself walking beside a stream, its banks lined with tall ichu grass that sways like gold in the afternoon breeze. Somewhere ahead, the sound of voices and the faint smell of roasting maize mark the next tambo and the next handoff in this endless relay. The tambo here is busier than the others you've seen. Its courtyard is full of runners coming and going, each arriving with a quick, shallow breath and leaving with renewed energy. A large clay oven bakes flat rounds of maize bread, the warm scent curling into the air like an invitation. You notice a runner seated apart from the rest, his sandals beside him, carefully massaging his calves. His pack is small, just a wrapped quipu and a carved wooden cup. He looks up and smiles, a flash of gold from a tiny ornament tied into his hair. Here's your historical fact. Messengers often traveled in pairs along certain routes, not just for efficiency but for safety. In the case of injury, the second runner could carry the message forward without delay. From the corner of the courtyard, a deep, resonant note rings out, a conch shell trumpet. Another Chasky springs to his feet, slings his bag over his shoulder, and darts off without a backward glance. Here's your obscure tidbit. Some conch shells used by messengers were decorated with etched patterns or dyed with plant pigments, serving as both instruments and personal emblems. Historians still debate whether these designs were simply decorative, or if they served as a coded signature, letting people know exactly which runner was on the way. As the sun dips lower, the courtyard begins to empty, the air cooling quickly in the shadow of the mountains. The last runner to leave this station will be chasing daylight, each footfall a drumbeat against the stone, carrying words, goods, or the smallest pieces of the empire across a land where silence is vast. But the roads are never empty. You set out again just as the light begins to shift into that golden light afternoon glow, the kind that makes the mountains look less like rock and more like layers of folded fabric. The road curves along the slope, then drops into a narrow valley where the air is warmer, heavy with the scent of blooming kuntuta flowers, their crimson petals bright against the stone walls. Ahead, you spot a Chasky jogging lightly toward you, a strip of dried coca leaves tucked into his cheek. He slows only long enough to adjust the strap of his carrying cloth before darting past, his breath steady, his sandals whispering against the stones. Here's your historical fact. Coca leaves were a common and legal stimulant for Inca messengers, chewed to ease hunger, reduce fatigue, and help with the thin air of high altitudes. At a bend in the road, you notice a weathered stone marker, say white inscribed, with faint patterns. These were waypoints, carved with lines and symbols, likely serving as guides or boundary markers along the route. Here's your obscure tidbit. Some of these markers were shaped like animals or faces, a blend of functional cartography and quiet artistry. Historians still debate whether the designs carried specific instructions for messengers, or if they were more symbolic, intended to invoke the protection of local spirits. A bird of prey circles high above the valley, its shadow gliding over the road. The wind carries the faint sound of another conch shell blast from far behind you, another message already chasing yours, carried on the backs of runners whose names will never appear in the histories, but whose footsteps bound the empire together. The valley opens into a wide plain dotted with low stone structures and long strips of cultivated land. Farmers are working the fields, their calls to one another floating up in soft, even tones. The road here runs straight and smooth, the stones worn by centuries of passing feet. You meet a group of 2 runners resting in the shade of a wall, sharing a small pot of maca root stew. They offer you a taste nutty, earthy, and surprisingly filling. One gestures toward a large basket beside him, covered with a woven cloth. Here's your historical fact. The Chasqui network could also be used for the rapid movement of fresh produce to markets in major cities, ensuring variety even in remote mountain settlements. The runner lifts the cloth to reveal a load of green maize still in its husk, destined for a feast in a town you can barely see at the far end of the plain. Here's your obscure tidbit. In some regions, Chasqui carried small, fragrant herbs alongside their cargo, both to keep the food fresh and to mask any odors that might attract animals during the night. Historians still debate whether this was an official practice endorsed by the state, or simply a clever trick passed down from runner to runner. As you walk on, the road begins to narrow again, climbing toward the next ridge. Behind you, the 2 runners finish their stew, sling the basket between them, and take off at a pace so even and unhurried. It almost looks easy, though you suspect that after several miles, easy is a word best left unsaid. The climb back into the mountains is steady, the air growing cooler with each step. The stones here are smaller, set closely together like a woven mat, each one worn to a faint polish by centuries of sandals. You hear water before you see it, a thin stream slipping down the rock face, spilling across the path before vanishing into a crevice. A Chasqui is crouched at the stream, filling a gourd. He glances up, his face calm, the kind of quiet focus that comes from balancing speed with survival. Around his neck hangs a small woven amulet shaped like a hummingbird. Here's your historical fact. The Inca road system didn't just cross mountains, it also threaded through valleys, deserts, and even rainforests, with Chasqui trained to run in every kind of terrain. As you pass him, the runner wipes his hands on his tunic and sets off again, feet sure even on the slick stone. His pace never falters, even when the path edges dangerously close to a cliff. Here's your obscure tidbit. Some runners swore by charms or talismans for protection, believing they could keep away misfortune or injuries. These could be as simple as a carved stone, or as elaborate as a small gold pendant. Historians still debate whether such charms were purely personal superstitions or part of a larger, sanctioned ritual within the messenger system. Above you, the ridgeline cuts sharply into the sky, the road climbing toward it in patient zigzags. Somewhere on the other side, another runner is waiting in the wind, watching for a figure to appear and bring him a piece of the empire to carry forward. The ridge is steeper than it looked from below. By the time you reach the top, the wind is pressing against you with enough force to make each step deliberate. From here, the view is endless mountains unfolding in every direction, valleys hidden beneath layers of shadow and light. A small tambo sits tucked into a hollow just below the peak. You step inside to find 2 runners seated on low stools, carefully untangling a length of quipu. The cords are bright against the dim interior, each knot deliberate, each space intentional. Here's your historical fact. Quippers were not just numerical records, they could encode complex information, from census data to military orders, all carried without a single written word. One runner gestures to a pot of steaming mate de coca tea, the scent sharp and herbal. You drink slowly, feeling the warmth seep through your chest. Here's your obscure tidbit. In some accounts, Chasqui were trained to memorize entire messages verbally, in case a quipu was damaged or lost en route, repeating the words over and over, in rhythm with their steps. Historians still debate whether these verbal backups were common practice or only used in emergencies. Outside, the wind has shifted, and the clouds are moving faster, their shadows racing across the mountainsides. You watch one runner shoulder the quipu, tighten the strap, and vanish down the far side of the ridge, other link in a chain that never sleeps, never stops, and never questions the weight of what it carries.